Hey guys, tonight we are venturing back, way back, into the fascinating and often rather perplexing world of ancient laws and customs. Imagine yourself not in your familiar surroundings, but transported to the rugged, windswept plateaus of ancient Anatolia in what is now modern-day Turkey sometime in the 2nd millennium BC. You're about to become a sort of historical detective, sifting through the remnants of a once mighty then long-lost empire, the Hittites. And our focus: their surprisingly detailed, occasionally quite peculiar and utterly absorbing laws concerning marriage and divorce. Now trying to successfully navigate ancient Hittite society without a pretty solid understanding of their incredibly specific and sometimes rather baffling legal codes, especially those dictating who you could marry, how much they might metaphorically cost, and what precisely happened if you wanted a marital refund, so to speak. You'd probably find yourself accidentally betrothed to your neighbor's prize ox after a misunderstanding about a dowry payment, or perhaps owing 3 generations of your family's labor in fines for an unintentional breach of kinship rules. It was definitely advisable to read the clay tablet fine print very, very carefully. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, do let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your little corner of the world. It's always so fascinating to see where these sleepy historical explorations find an ear. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your journey begins. Egeria in the heart of Anatolia. A vast high plateau characterized by rolling hills, stark mountain ranges, and fertile river valleys that have cradled civilizations for millennia. We are talking about a time roughly between 1600 and 1178 BC. The height of the Bronze Age, a period of mighty empires, thundering chariots, and gods who demanded very specific and often quite elaborate forms of appeasement. For centuries, the Hittites were one of the dominant powers in this ancient Near Eastern world, their empire rivaling those of Egypt and Babylonia. They clashed with Pharaoh Ramesses II at the famous Battle of Kadesh, they controlled vital trade routes, and they built monumental cities. And then, like so many ancient civilizations, their empire collapsed, their cities crumbled, and their very name faded into the mists of legend. Mentioned only fleetingly in biblical texts as one of the many peoples of Canaan. For thousands of years, the Hittites were essentially a lost civilization. That is until the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when archaeologists drawn by enigmatic ruins and those tantalizing biblical references began to excavate sites in central Turkey. The most significant of these was a place called Boğazköy, which to the astonishment of the scholarly world turned out to be the site of Hattusa, the mighty fortified capital of the Hittite Empire. Imagine the thrill of those early excavators brushing away the dust of millennia to uncover massive stone walls, cyclopean foundations of temples and palaces, imposing gateways flanked by carved lions and sphinxes, and most importantly, for our story, vast archives of clay tablets inscribed with a hitherto undeciphered cuneiform script. It was like stumbling upon a forgotten library from a superhero movie revealing the secrets of a once dominant but long vanished global power. Oh, that rather impressive pile of very large, very old rocks over there. One might imagine a local farmer casually remarking to a bewildered archaeologist, "That's just where King Tudalia used to hold his summer court, apparently. Do try to mind the cuneiform inscriptions if you're poking around. They're a devil to dust." A mainstream historical fact is that the Hittites were indeed a significant Bronze Age Anatolian people who established this powerful empire with its capital at Hattusa. The discovery of their extensive archives numbering tens of thousands of cuneiform clay tablets, primarily in the early 20th century, has provided invaluable direct insights into their language, an early Indo-European tongue, their complex religion, their sophisticated diplomatic practices, their rich mythology, and crucially for our purposes tonight, their highly developed legal system. These clay tablets are our time machines. Many were accidentally baked hard and thus preserved when Hattusa was eventually sacked and burned around 1178 BC. Others may have been deliberately fired in kilns for archival purposes. They were written in cuneiform, that distinctive wedge-shaped script impressed into wet clay. A writing system originally developed by the Sumerians and adapted by many cultures across the ancient Near East. Deciphering Hittite cuneiform was a monumental scholarly achievement in itself, unlocking a treasure trove of information. Among these tablets were copies of the Hittite laws, one of the earliest and most comprehensive legal codes known from the ancient Indo-European world. While perhaps not as globally famous as the Code of Hammurabi from Babylonia, the Hittite laws offer a fascinating and often surprisingly nuanced glimpse into how this society sought to regulate itself. They are predominantly casuistic in form, meaning they are structured as a series of if-then statements. If a man does X, then Y shall be the consequence. What makes them particularly interesting, especially in comparison to some contemporary Mesopotamian codes, is a noticeable tendency towards restitution and compensation, rather than purely eye for an eye retribution for many offenses, though harsh penalties certainly existed for others. The precise origins of the Hittite people and their subsequent arrival and settlement in Anatolia, along with the exact timeline of their early kingdom formation before the establishment of the Old Kingdom around 1600 BC, remain subjects of ongoing archaeological and linguistic research and lively scholarly debate, with various theories proposed based on interpretations of early textual references, pottery styles, and patterns of material culture across the Anatolian plateau. These laws cover a vast range of human activity: homicide, assault, theft, agricultural damages, witchcraft, and of particular interest to us, an extensive and remarkably detailed set of regulations concerning family life, marriage, divorce, inheritance, and sexual conduct. It is within these legal pronouncements, meticulously inscribed on clay by long-dead Hittite scribes, that we can begin to decode the social structures, the deeply held values, the anxieties, and the everyday realities of Hittite domestic life. They reveal a society profoundly concerned with maintaining social order, ensuring the continuity of family lines, protecting property rights, which were often intrinsically linked to marriage arrangements, and regulating relationships in a way that preserved the stability of the state. The term peculiar, which we've used in our overall topic, is of course subjective. What seems strange or unusual to us, Ageria, from our distant vantage point, would have been perfectly normal, logical, and indeed necessary to a Hittite living in Hattusa 3,500 years ago. Yet, as we delve into these ancient laws, we will undoubtedly encounter customs and legal solutions that challenge our modern assumptions about marriage and family, some that seem remarkably harsh, others surprisingly pragmatic, and a few that are just delightfully, bewilderingly different. Deciphering these cuneiform tablets must have been like attempting to read a very important, very official text message that was unfortunately dictated by a rather irritable and uncooperative chicken that only knows how to communicate in complex geometric shapes. But thank goodness those dedicated scholars persevered, because without their efforts we would know so much less about the fascinating intricacies of Hittite prenuptial agreements, which, as it turns out, were often surprisingly thorough, if occasionally a bit baffling to the modern reader. So prepare yourself to step into the world of Hittite scribes, royal decrees, and everyday Anatolian families, as we begin to unearth the lost laws that once governed their most intimate relationships, starting as all such stories must, with how it all began. You stand, Ageria, in the imaginary dust of Hattusa, the once mighty capital of the Hittite Empire, a city whose secrets lay buried for millennia beneath the Anatolian soil. The grand stone lions at its gates, the Cyclopean walls, the foundations of its temples, and palaces all whisper of a powerful, complex civilization that vanished from the main stage of history, leaving only faint echoes. But it is not the monumental architecture alone that will allow us to decode their peculiar ways of marriage and divorce. It is something far smaller, far more fragile, yet infinitely more revealing: the humble clay tablet. Humble clay, deep within the royal archives and temple libraries of Hattusa archaeologists in the early 20th century, unearthed a treasure trove. Tens of thousands of these baked clay rectangles, densely covered in the intricate wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform script. These tablets, these silent storytellers, are our primary key to unlocking the Hittite world. Imagine the scene of discovery. Scholars carefully brushing away the compacted earth, revealing row upon row of these ancient documents. Some perfectly preserved, others frustratingly fragmented. Each tablet, once damp clay impressed by a Hittite scribe's reed stylus, some 3,500 years ago, now holds the potential to reveal a lost word. A forgotten king, a strange ritual, or for our purposes, a peculiar law that once governed the most intimate aspects of Hittite life. It's like finding a hidden room in an old house and discovering it's not full of cobwebs and broken furniture, but with meticulously kept diaries, legal ledgers, and official correspondence from a family you never knew existed. The first challenge, of course, was the language and the script. A mainstream historical fact is that the Hittite laws, primarily known from these cuneiform tablets found at Hattusa, which mostly date to the Old Hittite Kingdom around 1650-1500 BC, though we have later copies and revisions represent one of the oldest and most extensive legal corpora from the ancient Near East. The language itself, Hittite turned out to be the earliest attested Indo-European language, a stunning linguistic discovery that connected this Anatolian empire to a vast family of languages stretching from India to Europe. Its decipherment, largely credited to the Czech scholar Bedřich Hrozný in the early 20th century, was a monumental feat of linguistic detective work. And the script, it was cuneiform borrowed from Mesopotamia, a complex system involving hundreds of wedge-shaped signs representing syllables, words, and determinatives. Imagine trying to learn cuneiform. It's like deciding to learn an alien alphabet that looks like it was exclusively designed by a committee of very tiny, very angry, and exceptionally precise woodpeckers who only communicate in intricate geometric patterns. You'd need a high-quality magnifying glass, the patience of a particularly stoic mountain, and probably a very good chiropractor from all that inevitable hunching over replica clay tablets. Hittite scribes, you realize, must have undergone incredibly rigorous training to master this demanding script. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that their education would have involved years of copying texts, memorizing sign lists, and learning the Sumero-Akkadian cuneiform tradition before they could even begin to write effectively in their own Hittite language using those borrowed wedges. They probably had their own ancient versions of extremely challenging pop quizzes and terrifying final exams, possibly with the looming threat of being permanently reassigned to inventorying the royal sheep dung collection if they consistently failed to distinguish their ash from their ish. Once deciphered, these tablets began to tell their tales. Among the historical annals, the religious texts, the diplomatic correspondence, and the epic poems, a significant number were found to contain the Hittite laws. This isn't a single monumental stone stele like the famous Code of Hammurabi dramatically erected in a public square for all to see. Instead, the Hittite laws are known from multiple tablet copies, suggesting they were perhaps reference works for judges or scribes, or part of a legal curriculum. They are typically organized into two main tablets or series, the first containing roughly 100 laws, and the second another 100 covering a vast array of subjects. And a surprisingly large portion of these laws you discover deal directly with what we would call family law regulations concerning marriage contracts. The payment and return of bride prices and dowries prohibited unions, adultery divorce procedures, the division of property upon marital dissolution, the status of widows, the rights of children, and even the complexities of marriage among enslaved individuals. The sheer detail lavished upon these domestic matters tells you immediately that the Hittites placed enormous importance on the structure and stability of the family unit as a cornerstone of their society. It's like they anticipated every single potentially awkward family dinner scenario, every possible marital dispute, and diligently wrote a specific, legally binding rule for it. If a man's prize ox wanders off and accidentally elopes with his neighbor's sacred goat, the fine shall be, well, let's just say it involves a lot of silver and a very public apology to the goat's bewildered family. Okay, maybe not that exact goat scenario, but they were remarkably thorough about other things. What makes these Hittite laws so fascinating and sometimes peculiar to our modern eyes isn't just their antiquity, but also their distinct character. While they share some features with other Near Eastern legal traditions, they also stand apart. For instance, there's often a greater emphasis on monetary compensation or restitution for offenses, rather than the purely retaliatory eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth principle found more starkly in Hammurabi's code, at least for many categories of crime. They are also very casuistic, meaning they are framed as specific cases. If a man does X, then Y shall happen. This makes them feel very grounded in real-life situations, offering little windows into the everyday squabbles and serious transgressions of Hittite society. Intriguingly, some laws show clear evidence of revision over time. You'll find tablets that state, formerly for this offense, the punishment was Z, But now the king has decreed that the punishment shall be Y. It's like reading ancient software patch notes, Hittite Law version 2. A fixed bug where thieves of sacred bread were merely fined. Now they also have to perform a rather embarrassing public dance. User feedback indicated previous penalty lacked sufficient deterrent. This shows a legal system that was not static but capable of evolving. Scholars continue to debate the precise relationship between the written Hittite laws, as meticulously preserved on these cuneiform tablets, and the actual day-to-day legal practices as they were enforced across the diverse regions and varied social strata of the sprawling Hittite Empire. With some questioning whether these collected codes were intended as strictly prescriptive, universally applied law issued directly from the king, or if they function more as scribal legal guidelines. Scholarly compilations of case law, or even idealized models for local courts and elders to consult. Regardless of their exact function in daily legal administration, these tablets with their densely packed wedges are your primary source material. Egeria. They are the voices of the Hittites themselves speaking to you across more than 3 millennia, telling tales not just of kings and battles, but of ordinary people grappling with the complexities of love, marriage, betrayal, and belonging. And as you begin to decipher the specific clauses related to forming and dissolving unions, you prepare to uncover some truly peculiar and often surprisingly insightful approaches to the eternal human drama of family life. You are now surrounded, Egeria, by the ghostly presence of Hittite scribes and the silent, enduring authority of their clay tablets. You've seen how these cuneiform wedges, once painstakingly impressed into damp clay, have survived millennia to offer us a precious, if fragmented, window into their long-lost Anatolian world. Having appreciated the medium, it's time to delve into the message, particularly as it pertains to the very foundations of Hittite society, the intricate and often surprisingly pragmatic institution of marriage. And the first thing that strikes you as you begin to decode these ancient family laws is that for the Hittites, marriage seems to have been viewed less as a grand romantic passion play, and far more as a carefully constructed, legally binding, and economically significant bargain between families. Forget the soaring sonnets of later European troubadours or the dramatic, heart-wrenching declarations of eternal love you might find in a different set of ancient scrolls. A Hittite marriage proposal, if we can even call it that, in the modern sense, probably sounded a good deal more like a serious business negotiation. Imagine a prospective groom's father approaching the father of a desirable bride. "My esteemed colleague and potential future in-law." He might begin after the appropriate exchange of pleasantries, and perhaps a shared cup of something suitably Bronze Age. "My family notes with approval the excellent reputation of your household and the admirable industriousness of your daughter, who we hear can weave a truly exceptional quantity of wool in a single day. We are therefore prepared to offer for her hand in marriage to my son." A strapping young lad with a promising future in chariot maintenance, the sum of 3 prize-winning sheep, 1 slightly used, but still quite serviceable bronze plowshare, and a solemn guarantee of no fewer than 2 sturdy male heirs within the first 5 years. Do we have an accord, or do I perhaps need to sweeten the pot with a particularly well-behaved milking goat? A mainstream historical fact is that Hittite marriage, as overwhelmingly reflected in their preserved law codes, from around the 17th to the 13th centuries BC, was fundamentally a contractual arrangement established primarily between the 2 families involved, rather than being based on the romantic love or individual choice of the prospective spouses. The primary purposes of these unions were deeply practical, to create or solidify alliances between families or clans to ensure the legitimate continuation of family lines through the birth of heirs, to manage the orderly transfer of property and wealth, and generally to maintain the social and economic stability of the community and, by extension, the state. This contractual, almost commercial nature of marriage is evident in the sheer amount of legal text dedicated to the financial aspects of the union. The laws are meticulously concerned with the kushada, or bride price, a payment or series of gifts made by the groom or his family to the family of the bride, and the iwaru, or dowry, the property, goods, or wealth that the bride brought with her into the marriage from her own family. We'll delve into the specifics of these in later sections, but their prominence in the legal codes immediately signals that marriage was in many ways a significant economic transaction and investment, a carefully balanced exchange of assets and obligations. The Hittite laws spend so much time in cuneiform ink detailing precisely who gets which specific goat, How many sheep constitute a fair exchange, or what happens to the slightly chipped bronze cauldron if the marriage unfortunately goes south, you almost start to think the livestock and household goods were considered more central to the proceedings than the long-term emotional well-being of the actual couple involved. Clause 37b, subsection R. A Hittite lawyer might intone, in the regrettable case of irreconcilable differences leading to dissolution, the wife shall retain possession of the good loom and 3 measures of barley. The husband shall receive the slightly less good loom and the somewhat grumpy ox, and the prize-winning family goat. May, if it so chooses, file a formal petition for emotional damages and seek alternative grazing arrangements. This doesn't mean that personal affection or attraction played absolutely no role in Hittite relationships, of course. Human emotions are a constant across time and culture. However, the extent to which individual affection or personal preference played any truly significant role in Hittite marriage choices, especially for first marriages despite the overwhelmingly contractual and family-driven nature so evident in the surviving legal texts, remains a particularly difficult aspect of Hittite social life for historians to fully ascertain, as the formal, legalistic nature of our primary sources rarely offers direct glimpses into private emotions or individual romantic desires. The laws are concerned with the public structural aspects of marriage, not the private stirrings of the heart. Love may have blossomed within these arranged unions, or it may not have. But from a legal standpoint, it wasn't the primary consideration for forming the contract. The bargain aspect of Hittite marriage is also highlighted by the implied negotiations that must have preceded any formal agreement. The laws detail various scenarios and the financial consequences, suggesting that the initial terms, the amount of the bride price, the value of the dowry, the responsibilities of each family, were subject to discussion and agreement. Getting married in Hattusa or any other Hittite town wasn't just about 2 young people catching each other's eye across a crowded barley field. It was more like a carefully planned merger and acquisition between 2 established family corporations. Our esteemed family, a representative might declare, brings to this potential union a strong lineage in expert goat herding, an impressive collection of well-maintained bronze farming implements, and 3 daughters known for their exceptional cheese-making skills. What valuable assets and useful connections does your family propose to bring to this mutually beneficial matrimonial venture? While the surviving tablets are primarily law codes, they strongly imply that these marriage agreements, once settled, would have involved some level of formalization to be legally binding, perhaps involving witnesses from both families, the pronouncement of specific vows or undertakings, and possibly even written contracts for very high status or complex arrangements. A quirky or fringe tidbit particularly relevant for royal unions is that some Hittite marriage contracts, especially those forming parts of international treaties where a Hittite princess might marry a foreign king or vice versa, were incredibly detailed. These marriage treaties could specify not just the property involved, but also intricate political allegiances, the expected diplomatic behavior of the royal spouse, and even clauses about the succession of their children. It was like a pre-nuptial agreement, combined with a detailed job description, a complex political treaty, and a legally binding loyalty oath, all rolled into one very important clay tablet. This emphasis on marriage as a carefully regulated contract, a bargain, struck between families with significant economic and social implications, sets the stage for understanding all the peculiar and specific laws that follow. It tells you that for the Hittites, marriage was far too important an institution to be left solely to the unpredictable whims of individual hearts. It was a pillar of their society, a fundamental mechanism for creating order, transferring wealth, and ensuring the continuity of their world, all carefully inscribed one wedge at a time onto enduring clay. You've now firmly grasped Ageria, that in the world of the ancient Hittites, as revealed by those remarkably preserved clay tablets, marriage was far less a matter of starry-eyed romance whispered under an Anatolian moon, and far more a carefully constructed legal and economic contract, a serious bargain struck between families. This fundamental understanding naturally leads us to the next crucial question. If marriage is a familial agreement, how then were partners actually chosen? Who was doing the choosing, and what were they looking for? Prepare to leave your modern notions of courtship and individual choice at the door of the imaginary Hittite house we're about to enter. Because partner selection here is a whole different ballgame played primarily by seasoned family strategists. Given that marriage was at its core an alliance between two kin groups, It follows logically that the selection of spouses was overwhelmingly orchestrated by the heads of these families, typically the fathers or other senior male relatives. A mainstream historical fact is that arranged marriages meticulously planned by parents or family elders, primarily for strategic social, political, and economic advantage, rather than the personal choice or romantic affection of the individuals directly involved, were the predominant, almost exclusive form of marital union in most ancient societies, including, by all indications, the Hittite civilization. The prospective bride and groom, especially for a first marriage, often had very little, if any, direct say in the matter. Their role was largely to acquiesce to the decisions made in their best familial interest. Choosing a spouse in Hittite times wasn't about swiping right on a particularly well-incised cuneiform dating profile after seeing a flattering chariot selfie. It was far more likely to involve your dad having a series of very serious protracted meetings, with another dad probably involving a great deal of solemn nodding, some strategic and thoughtful beard stroking, and a minute, almost forensic discussion of your respective family's historical goat-to-arable acreage ratios and their prospects for future expansion. What were the primary motivations driving these familial decisions? First and foremost, alliances. A good marriage could forge or strengthen crucial bonds between two families, creating a network of mutual support, shared resources, and political solidarity. In a world where local rivalries could flare up or where larger political stability was not always guaranteed, having strong familial connections through marriage was a vital form of social insurance. Marrying a daughter to a neighboring landowner or a son to the daughter of an influential official could smooth over past disputes, open up new opportunities for trade or advancement, or provide a buffer against potential enemies. Secondly, status was a massive consideration. Families would naturally seek to marry their children into households of at least equal and preferably higher social standing. Marriage was a way to maintain or improve the family's position within the intricate Hittite social hierarchy. A good match was one that reflected well on both families and enhanced their collective prestige. Conversely, a bad match marrying too far below one's perceived station could bring social disapproval or diminish the family's standing. Thirdly, and inextricably linked to the first two, were economic benefits. As we've seen, marriage involves significant transfers of property, the Kushata bride price moving from the groom's family to the bride's, and the Iwaru dowry, which the bride brought with her. Families would therefore be looking to maximize their economic advantage through these exchanges. A family with many sons might seek brides whose families could offer substantial dowries, bringing much-needed wealth or productive assets into the household. A family with desirable daughters might negotiate a handsome bride price, compensating them for the loss of the daughter's labor and her reproductive capacity and adding to their own coffers. It was a delicate and sometimes quite ruthless economic balancing act. And finally, but certainly not least, was a crucial goal of procreation. Specifically, the production of legitimate heirs to continue the family line, inherit property, maintain ancestral cults, and provide for the parents in their old age. The potential fertility of a bride, her health, and her perceived ability to bear strong children, especially sons in a patriarchal society, would have been important, if perhaps unspoken considerations. So what constituted an ideal spouse from a Hittite family's pragmatic perspective? For a prospective bride, her family background and reputation were paramount. Was she from a respected lineage? Was she known for her diligence, her skills, and household management, including, as we discussed in another context, weaving her obedience and her virtue? Did she come with a respectable dowry that would enhance the groom's household? For a prospective groom, similar considerations applied. Did he come from a good family? Did he possess or have prospects of inheriting sufficient land, livestock, or other forms of wealth to support a wife and children adequately? Was he of good character, capable of fulfilling his responsibilities as a husband and head of a new family unit? His ability to provide the agreed-upon bride price would also be a non-negotiable prerequisite. The desirable qualities, as you can see, were less about sparkling wit or a shared love for sunset chariot rides, and more about solid practical assets and a good reputation. Wanted Hittite spouse. Must come from a family with no outstanding blood-curdling blood feuds currently active, possess a reasonable number of non-diseased and clearly productive livestock, and preferably not snore loudly enough to inadvertently wake the great storm god Tarhuna during his sacred afternoon nap. A demonstrable ability to tolerate lengthy, detailed legal negotiations concerning property division is definitely a plus. How are these matches actually made? While the Hittite laws don't explicitly detail a formal matchmaking profession, as seen in some other ancient cultures, it's highly plausible that trusted intermediaries, perhaps elder relatives, respected community figures, or even professional, though likely unofficial matchmakers, might have played a role in identifying suitable partners and facilitating the initial delicate discussions between families. Reputation and observation within the community would also be key. Families would be acutely aware of other eligible households in their town, village, or region. Once a potential pairing was identified, the formal and often quite complex negotiations over the bride price, dowry, and other terms of the marriage contract would begin in earnest. The degree of agency, if any, that Hittite women, particularly young unmarried daughters, possessed in influencing the choice of their marriage partners despite the undeniably patriarchal framework of these arranged unions is a subtle and often challenging question for historians to piece together, relying as they do on the nuanced phrasing of often quite formal legal texts and occasional fleeting references in other documents such as private letters or religious prayers, which rarely give direct voice to female perspectives on such matters. The laws certainly focus on the agreements and actions of the male heads of households. It's generally assumed that the consent of the individuals, especially the bride, was often minimal or entirely non-existent, particularly for a first marriage. Daughters in many patriarchal ancient societies were often viewed as valuable assets to be given in marriage in a way that best served the strategic interests of their natal family. The prospective Hittite bride's direct input on her future husband was probably quite limited, perhaps confined to a hopeful prayer that he wasn't too old, too cruel, or too conspicuously lacking in basic personal hygiene. Is he generally alive? She might discreetly inquire of her mother. Does he own at least one non-terminally collapsing hut and a vaguely functional plow? Excellent. I shall begin packing my dowry, which consists of 3 exceptionally good spinning wheels, 2 sturdy cooking pots, and 1 slightly grumpy but remarkably fertile sheep. The age of marriage was also likely quite young by modern standards, especially for girls who might be betrothed or married in their early to mid-teens, as was common in many ancient societies to maximize their childbearing years. This entire system of choosing partners, so alien to modern ideals of romantic love and individual choice, was designed to ensure social stability, economic prosperity, and the orderly continuation of families and communities in the challenging world of Bronze Age Anatolia. It was a pragmatic solution to the fundamental human need for alliance and procreation, all carefully framed and regulated by Hittite law. You're now firmly embedded in the mindset of a Hittite family elder, a Geria contemplating the intricate dance of forging a marital alliance in ancient Anatolia. You understand that these unions are far less about fleeting romantic passions and far more about pragmatic family-driven strategies for alliance status and economic stability. The choice of partners is largely out of the hands of the young couple themselves, resting instead with the heads of their respective households, who are essentially negotiating a very significant, multifaceted contract. And a cornerstone of this contractual bargain, a practice deeply embedded in Hittite law and custom, is the payment known as the kushita, often translated as bride price or bride wealth. This isn't just a quaint tradition. It's a serious, legally significant, and often quite substantial transfer of assets from the groom's family to the family of the bride. Now it's important to approach the concept of the kushata with a bit of nuance. To modern ears, bride price can sound uncomfortably like buying a wife, conjuring up images of a purely commercial transaction where a woman is treated as mere chattel. While there's no denying the strong economic component and the patriarchal framework within which these transactions occurred, the Hittite kushata and similar bride wealth customs in many other ancient and traditional societies was a far more complex institution than a simple purchase. A mainstream historical fact is that the payment of a bride price or bride wealth by the groom's family to the bride's family was a common and integral feature of marriage arrangements in numerous ancient Near Eastern societies, including the Hittite kingdom. This practice served a variety of crucial social and economic functions, including compensating the bride's natal family for the loss of her labor and reproductive capacity, legitimizing the marriage and its offspring, and solidifying the alliance between the two families. So what exactly did this kushata entail? It was essentially a significant payment, A transfer of valuable goods or property that flowed from the groom's side, his father, or perhaps the groom himself if he was already established, to the father or legal guardian of the bride. The form of this payment could vary. The Hittite laws, those wonderfully detailed cuneiform tablets we've been discussing, sometimes mention specific amounts or types of goods, often in relation to different social classes or particular circumstances. Silver weighed out in shekels was a common component, reflecting its status as a key medium of exchange. Livestock, oxen, sheep, goats, were also frequently part of the kushata, representing tangible wealth and productive assets in an agrarian society. Sometimes land-valuable textiles, bronze tools or weapons or other desirable goods might be included. The bride price wasn't just a symbolic bouquet of flowers and a nice box of Bronze Age chocolates. We're talking serious tangible assets here. Imagine a young Hittite man smitten, or at least his family is strategically smitten with a girl from the next valley. His father might sigh and say, "All right, son, if you truly have your heart set on marrying that particular young woman, whose family is known for their exceptionally fertile barley fields and their remarkably placid sheep, it's going to cost us. Prepare to part with your second-best chariot, a significant portion of the family's painstakingly accumulated silver stash, and possibly even your lucky sheep-shearing tunic that you inherited from great-uncle Zuzu. True love, or at least a socially advantageous marital alliance, is decidedly expensive in the Bronze Age. The amount of the kushata was not fixed like a price tag in a shop. It would have been subject to careful and sometimes lengthy negotiation between the two families, reflecting a range of factors: the social status and wealth of both families, the perceived value or desirability of the bride, her lineage, her skills, her reputation, her potential fertility, and perhaps even the eagerness of the groom's family to secure the alliance. The kushata negotiations were probably the ancient Anatolian equivalent of a very intense episode of Let's Make a Deal, but with more at stake than a new chariot behind curtain number 3. Picture the scene: two stern-faced patriarchs surrounded by their advisors, and perhaps a few hopeful younger relatives haggling over oxen and shekels. For this exceptionally diligent, moderately cheerful, and highly skilled wool-carding daughter, who also, I might add, comes from a lineage entirely free of troublesome prophetic dreams. The bride's father might declare, "We are asking no less than 3 prime oxen, 10 breeding ewes of impeccable pedigree, and that rather shiny bronze cauldron your family displayed at the last spring festival. And perhaps a small discount on future chariot repairs from your son." The groom's father might counter, "An admirable valuation, esteemed colleague, but 3 oxen seems a trifle steep given the current barley futures. Might we perhaps discuss 2 oxen, 12 ewes? Some slightly less pedigreed, perhaps the cauldron, though it has a small, almost unnoticeable dent, and will throw in a guarantee of an annual tribute of 6 jars of our finest fermented goat's milk." Odd. The legal significance of the kushata was profound. Its payment was often an essential component for a marriage to be considered fully legitimate and legally binding according to Hittite law. The laws frequently refer to scenarios where the kushata has been paid or partially paid or needs to be returned. And these circumstances dictate the legal standing of the union and the rights of the parties involved. For example, if a betrothed girl died before the marriage could be consummated, or if one party broke off the engagement under specific conditions, the laws would stipulate what happened to the bride price already handed over. It wasn't just a gift, it was a crucial legal token. A quirky or fringe tidbit from the Hittite law codes is their meticulous attention to such what-if scenarios. There are clauses dealing with what happens if a suitor defiles a girl, i.e., has premarital relations with her, often framed as a property offense against her father, before the full bride price is settled, or if a man carries off a woman without her father's consent. These situations often involved adjusted payments, fines, or specific legal remedies related to the kushata, highlighting its centrality in regularizing sexual relationships and formalizing marital bonds. Sometimes part of the kushata could even be rendered in the form of labor or service by the groom to the bride's father for a set period, a practice reminiscent of the biblical story of Jacob working for Laban to marry Rachel and Leah. The precise socio-economic function and the deepest symbolic meaning of the Hittite kushata, whether it should be understood primarily as a straightforward compensation to the bride's family for the economic loss of a productive member, a mechanism for legitimizing the resulting offspring and incorporating them into the groom's lineage. A way to publicly cement interfamily alliances and create reciprocal obligations, or a complex combination of these and other cultural factors, is a subject of ongoing analysis and rich discussion by Hittitologists, legal historians, and anthropologists. It likely served all these functions to some degree, reflecting the multifaceted nature of marriage itself in Hittite society. It's also important to briefly distinguish the kushata from the iwaru or dowry, which we will explore in more detail later. While the kushata flowed from the groom's family to the bride's family, the iwaru was the property that the bride brought with her from her own natal family into her new marital home. These were two distinct, though often interconnected parts of the complex economic transactions surrounding a Hittite marriage. The Hittite laws are also quite clear that if a marriage didn't work out for certain legally recognized reasons, and a divorce occurred, the kushata, or at least significant portions of it, might have to be returned to the groom's family. This acted as a kind of financial disincentive against frivolous dissolution of the marriage by the bride's side, and also underscored its nature as a conditional transfer of wealth linked to the success and continuation of the union. It's like a Bronze Age returns policy, but with significantly more livestock involved and probably a lot less cheerful customer service. So as you stand on the threshold of understanding Hittite marriage Egeria, the concept of the kushata looms large. It's a clear indication that forming a family was a serious property-laden business, a carefully weighed bargain where assets were exchanged, alliances forged, and the very future of lineages meticulously negotiated, all under the watchful cuneiform inscribed gaze of Hittite law. You're now well-versed. Egeria in the Hittite concept of the kushata, that significant transfer of wealth from the groom's family to the bride's, an essential component in the complex socio-economic bargain that constituted marriage in ancient Hattusa. It was a clear acknowledgement of the bride's value to her natal family and a legitimizing seal upon the new union. But this financial current didn't just flow in one direction. To balance the scales and to provide for the bride in her new life, another crucial institution played its part: the iwaru, or as we would more commonly call it, the dowry. This was the property, the goods, the wealth that you as a Hittite bride would bring with you from your father's house into the household of your new husband. It wasn't just a parting gift, it was a carefully considered endowment with significant legal and social implications. A mainstream historical fact is that the provision of a dowry known as iwaru in the Hittite language by the bride's family to the newly married couple was a well-established and legally regulated custom in Hittite society, much like it was in many other ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean cultures. The Hittite law codes, those invaluable cuneiform tablets, dedicate specific clauses to the composition of the dowry, and importantly, its disposition in various scenarios such as divorce or the wife's death, indicating its recognized importance in the marital economy. So, what exactly constituted a Hittite iwaru? It could encompass a wide range of assets reflecting the wealth and status of your family. Egeria. Primarily, it consisted of movable goods. Think of finely woven textiles, perhaps some beautiful woolen garments dyed in vibrant colors, intricately patterned blankets, or valuable linen cloths. Remember, textiles were a significant form of wealth in the ancient world. Your dowry would certainly include personal adornments, jewelry made of bronze, perhaps silver. If your family was well off, beads of faience or semi-precious stones and bronze pins to fasten your robes. Essential household utensils would also feature prominently: bronze or pottery cooking pots and cauldrons, storage jars grinding stones for preparing grain, perhaps even your own personal loom and weaving tools if you were known for your skill in that essential female craft. A Hittite bride's dowry wasn't just a couple of nice, freshly laundered towels and a new toaster as a modern bride might receive. We're talking a serious collection of practical and valuable assets, prime breeding sheep, maybe a well-made chariot wheel or two, if your dad was feeling particularly generous, and quite possibly enough bronze pots and pans to start your own very small and potentially quite loud Anatolian street food orchestra. "Here you go, my dear son-in-law," your father might declare with a flourish. "My beloved daughter and her accompanying 20 surprisingly opinionated but remarkably fertile goats, plus 3 slightly chipped but perfectly serviceable grinding stones. Treat them all well, especially the goats. They have feelings, you know." The dowry also served several key purposes. It was intended to provide for your support and maintenance within your husband's household. It was a contribution from your family to the establishment of the new family unit you were forming. And in many ways, it could be seen as a form of pre-mortem inheritance, your share of your natal family's wealth, given to you at the time of your marriage rather than upon your father's death. The value of the Iwaru was a significant point of honor for your family, a public statement of their affection for you, and of course their own economic standing. Imagine the pre-wedding negotiations, not just about the kushata your groom's family was offering, but also about the Iwaru your family was prepared to send with you. All right. Esteemed future father-in-law, we will graciously accept your son as a husband for our precious daughter, provided her Iwaru includes not only the standard flock of 10 sheep and the ceremonial bronze ladle, but also that very nice set of intricately carved ivory loom weights we happened to notice in your workshop last spring. Her weaving standards are, as you know, exceptionally high, and she simply cannot be expected to produce inferior textiles due to substandard equipment. Crucially, the Hittite laws offer some intriguing insights into your legal rights as a wife concerning this dowry property. The precise degree of legal control a Hittite wife individually exercised over her dowry property, Iwaru, during the course of her marriage, as opposed to it being primarily managed by her husband. For the overall benefit of the joint household is a nuanced issue that legal historians and Hittitologists continue to carefully analyze based on the often concise phrasing of the relevant law clauses and the few surviving marriage contracts. However, the general implication from the law is that the Iwaru was considered in some significant sense to be your property, or at least property designated for your benefit and that of your children. It wasn't simply absorbed into your husband's general wealth with no strings attached. This becomes particularly clear when the laws discuss the fate of the Iwaru in the unfortunate event of divorce or your death. If the marriage dissolved, especially if the divorce was deemed to be the husband's fault, or by mutual consent under certain conditions, the laws often stipulated that you, the wife, could take your Iwaru, or at least a significant portion of it that was still identifiable back with you to your natal family. This provided a vital measure of economic security for a divorced woman in a patriarchal society, ensuring she wasn't left entirely destitute. It's like a Bronze Age, take your goats, your best cauldrons, your slightly judgmental bronze mirror, and get thee hence clause, but all properly codified on a clay tablet. Similarly, if you died, your Iwaru would typically pass to your children, rather than automatically reverting to your husband or his family, thus keeping that wealth within your direct lineage. A quirky or fringe tidbit that gives us a wonderfully intimate glimpse into the contents of these ancient endowments is that some actual Hittite dowry lists preserved on cuneiform tablets are incredibly specific and itemized. They don't just say household goods, they might list things like 1 blue woolen dress well made, 3 bronze toggle pins for fastening garments, a pair of good sturdy leather sandals, 2 slightly used but still perfectly functional grinding stones for barley, 1 small painted wooden chest for valuables, and even 1 fine-toothed wooden comb. Reading these lists feels like peering directly into a Hittite bride's trousseau from over 3,000 years ago, a poignant connection to the everyday objects that made up her personal world. The laws also sometimes address scenarios like the husband mismanaging or squandering the wife's dowry property, or what happened if specific dowry items were lost, stolen, or destroyed. The existence of such clauses suggests an attempt to protect the wife's economic interests at least to some degree within the marital household. A substantial Iwaru could therefore not only contribute to the economic well-being of your new family Ageria, but also subtly enhance your own status and provide a measure of financial leverage or security within your husband's household. It was a clear statement from your family that you were not entering this new life empty-handed, but as a woman of substance bringing valuable assets to the union. So the Hittite marriage bargain was a two-way street of property transfer. The kushata flowed from the groom's family to the bride's, acknowledging her value and compensating her kin. And the Iwaru flowed with you, the bride, from your natal family into your new home, providing for your establishment and securing a portion of your inheritance. Both were meticulously considered, often hotly negotiated, and carefully regulated by the surprisingly detailed and pragmatic laws of Hattusa. The serious, often quite intense business of negotiating your Hittite marriage contract Ageria is now complete. The kushata, that all-important bride price, has been satisfactorily paid by your groom's family to yours perhaps After some spirited Anatolian haggling involving precise numbers of sheep and the exact weight of silver. Your own Iwaru, the dowry you bring from your father's house filled with textiles, household goods, and perhaps a few prized personal adornments, has been agreed upon and is ready for transfer. The legal and economic foundations of your union are firmly in place, all meticulously accounted for, just as those cuneiform tablets would dictate. But what about the actual wedding itself? What did it feel like to say, "I do," or the Hittite equivalent thereof, some 3,500 years ago? Here our journey into the Hittite world becomes a little more speculative, a bit like trying to assemble a particularly ancient and intricate flat-pack chariot with only half the instruction manual and a lot of very confusing, slightly smudged cuneiform diagrams. Okay. You might ponder looking at the fragmentary evidence. So after the ritual goat blessing and the ceremonial exchange of bronze pins, do we process clockwise or anti-clockwise around the sacred turnip mound? And does anyone actually eat the turnip afterwards, or is it purely decorative? A mainstream historical fact is that while detailed, step-by-step descriptions of typical Hittite wedding ceremonies are unfortunately scarce in the surviving law codes, which are more concerned with the legalities than the rituals. Other textual sources like myths, prayers, festival descriptions, royal annals, and even international treaties detailing royal marriages, combined with archaeological evidence such as iconography on reliefs or small finds, allow scholars to piece together a plausible, if incomplete, picture. These sources suggest that Hittite weddings, like those in most ancient societies, involve processions, feasting music, and specific religious rituals intended to ensure the fertility and prosperity of the new couple and to publicly legitimize their union and the crucial alliance formed between their respective families. So let's try to reimagine your Hittite wedding day, Ageria. The day would likely begin with you being prepared in your father's house, perhaps adorned in special garments and jewelry, some of it part of your Iwaru. There would be a sense of excitement, anticipation, and probably a fair bit of communal female activity as your mother, sisters, aunts, and female attendants help you get ready. Then comes one of the most universal elements of weddings across cultures and time, the procession. You would be ceremonially escorted from your natal home to the home of your new husband, or perhaps to a designated ceremonial space. This procession could be quite an event, especially for prominent families. Imagine music, perhaps the reedy sound of pipes, the rhythmic beat of drums, the strumming of lyres, accompanying you and your retinue. Family members, friends, and well-wishers from the community would likely join in their presence a public affirmation of the event. The precise sequence and symbolic meaning of specific rituals that might have occurred within Hittite wedding ceremonies are often reconstructed by scholars through painstaking comparative analysis with the customs of other ancient Near Eastern cultures like Mesopotamia or Syria, with whom the Hittites had extensive contact, and through very careful, sometimes debated interpretations of often fragmentary Hittite religious, mythological, and festival texts. But some common symbolic actions seem highly probable. There might have been a ritual veiling of you, the bride, at some point, or perhaps a ceremonial unveiling when you reached your groom's home, symbolizing your transition from one family and status to another. The joining of hands, the dexteromaiunctio we've seen in other ancient cultures, could well have been a part of sealing the union. The sharing of a ceremonial meal or a special drink between you and your groom, and perhaps between the two families, would have been a potent symbol of your new shared life and the alliance formed. Religious elements would have been absolutely central. This wasn't just a social contract, it was a union formed under the eyes of the gods. Prayers and invocations would be offered to the myriad Hittite deities, particularly those associated with marriage, fertility, family, and the household. You might call upon Hanahana, the great mother goddess, for blessings of fruitfulness, Telepanu, the god of agriculture, for prosperity in your new home, various storm gods like Tarhuna for strength and protection, and the all-important sun goddess of Arina, one of the chief deities of the Hittite state, for overall favor and well-being. Small offerings, perhaps of grain, honey, or incense, might be made at a household shrine or a local temple. Priests or priestesses might have played a role in sanctifying the union, reciting incantations, or performing specific rituals to ensure good fortune and ward off any malevolent influences. And then, of course, there would be the feast. No ancient celebration, especially one as significant as a marriage, would be complete without a hearty, joyous feast. The Hittite wedding feast was probably an absolutely epic affair lasting perhaps for several days if the families were wealthy. Imagine tables, or perhaps just cloths, spread on the ground for many laden with the bounty of Anatolia. There would be mountains of freshly baked bread, the staple of life. Great quantities of beer, thick and nutritious, and perhaps wine from the hill country vineyards for those who could afford it. Roasted meats would feature prominently. Lamb, goat, perhaps even beef from a specially slaughtered ox if it was a very grand occasion. Savory stews bubbling in clay pots filled with grains, vegetables, and more meat. Fresh and dried fruits, nuts, and honey for sweetness. You certainly wouldn't leave a Hittite wedding feast feeling peckish, that's for sure. Though given the sheer abundance and the likely duration of the festivities, you might very well leave needing a slightly larger, more accommodating tunic and a very long nap. Entertainment would also have been part of the celebrations. We can imagine musicians playing those lyres, drums, and pipes. Their melodies perhaps lively and festive, perhaps more solemn and processional at different moments. Dancers might perform. Storytellers might recount ancient myths or heroic tales. It would be a time of communal joy, a public celebration of the new bond. Wedding entertainment. One imagines probably included a local lute player who knew exactly 3 very popular songs by heart. A slightly off-key but enthusiastic choir of well-meaning aunts offering traditional wedding dirges, or were they joyful odes? Hard to tell sometimes, and maybe your slightly tipsy great-uncle Zidanta regaling the assembled company with that same oft-repeated and increasingly embellished embarrassing story about the time he tried to wrestle a supposedly sacred, but actually just very irritated mountain goat. Some things, it seems, are truly timeless across all cultures. A quirky or fringe tidbit gleaned from some Hittite ritual texts and mythological fragments is the possible inclusion of mock abduction elements, or playful ritualized resistance from the bride's side during some part of the wedding festivities. This might have involved the groom's party having to overcome some symbolic obstacles to claim the bride, or the bride herself feigning reluctance to leave her natal home. These were likely highly symbolic performances rather than actual forceful events in most standard contractually agreed-upon marriages, perhaps representing the severance of the bride from her old family and her incorporation into the new, or the capture of her valuable fertility by the groom's lineage. Ultimately, your Hittite wedding ageria would be a multifaceted event, a legal formalization, an economic transaction, a religious sanctification, and a joyous communal celebration all rolled into one. It publicly affirmed your new status, solidified the alliance between your families, and under the watchful eyes of gods and mortals alike, officially launched your new life as a Hittite wife. Section 8. The joyous, if somewhat exhausting festivities of your Hittite wedding ageria have concluded. The last of the roasted mutton has been devoured. The final drops of beer or wine have been drained from the ceremonial cups, and the musicians have packed away their lyres and pipes. You have been ceremonially processed from your father's house, your Iwaru dowry has been duly transferred, and perhaps admired, and you are now officially incorporated into your husband's household, his oikos. This is where your new life truly begins within the intricate and legally defined hierarchy of a Bronze Age Anatolian family. And as you step across this new threshold, you enter a world where the roles, responsibilities, and power dynamics between husband and wife are clearly, if sometimes rather starkly, delineated by Hittite law and custom. A mainstream historical fact is that Hittite society, like most ancient Near Eastern civilizations, was fundamentally patriarchal. This means that the male head of the household, your husband, or perhaps his father if you were living in an extended family unit, held primary legal authority over all its members, including you, his wife, any children born to the union, and other dependents such as household servants or slaves. His word was to a significant extent law within the domestic sphere. This isn't to say it was necessarily a realm of unchecked tyranny. Hittite law, as we'll see, did provide certain, albeit limited, protections and avenues for redress, but the underlying structure was one of the male authority and female subordination. So you're a new Hittite wife. Congratulations, your daily to-do list, as implicitly and sometimes explicitly laid out by societal expectation and legal underpinning, probably looks something like this. 1. Diligently and skillfully manage all internal household affairs, from food preparation and storage to the absolutely crucial production of textiles. Remember, clothing your family and creating valuable fabrics was a massive undertaking. 2. Bear children, preferably several strapping sons, to continue your husband's lineage, inherit his property, and provide for you both in your old age. No pressure at all on that front, of course. Ensure the household gods, those minor deities and ancestral spirits who protected your specific family, are never ever out of their favorite brand of ritual incense or their daily thimbleful of specially brewed ceremonial beer. 4. And perhaps most subtly, but no less importantly, try to cultivate a harmonious or at least survivable relationship with your mother-in-law, if she's part of the household. Because as ancient proverbs from many cultures will attest, that particular dynamic can be a source of either great comfort or truly epic domestic sagas. Easy peasy right. Your primary domain, Ageria, is the inner workings of the house. You are the chief operating officer of the domestic economy. This involves overseeing the grinding of grain, the baking of bread. A daily labor-intensive task, the brewing of beer. Another staple, the tending of any household gardens, the preservation of foodstuffs, the care of young children, the supervision of any female servants or slaves. And as we've previously noted, the constant demanding cycle of spinning wool or flax into thread and weaving it into fabric for every conceivable need. This was not a life of idle leisure, even for women of relatively good standing. It was a position of considerable responsibility, requiring skill, foresight, and immense hard work. Your husband, meanwhile, has his own set of responsibilities. He is the primary provider and protector of the family. He manages the family's external affairs, its agricultural lands, its livestock, any craft production or trade ventures. He represents the household in the wider community in legal matters before local elders or royal courts, and in fulfilling civic or military duties to the state or the local lord. And of course, he holds ultimate authority within the home. The Hittite husband was definitely the designated boss of the household establishment. His word was generally speaking law. Mostly. Unless, of course, his otherwise dutiful wife happened to have brought a particularly substantial dowry into the marriage, possessed a very sharp intellect, and had developed a remarkably persuasive, if quietly delivered way of suggesting alternative courses of action that somehow always turned out to be for the greater good of the household. Yes, my dearest Tarhunzada, you might gently murmur to your husband, your ambitious plan to personally wrestle that slightly feral mountain bull into submission to impress the visiting dignitary is indeed a testament to your undeniable valor. However, have you perhaps considered not doing that particular thing today and instead focusing your formidable energies on, say, mending that rather alarming crack in the main roof beam before the winter rains turn our sleeping quarters into a small, unpleasantly damp lake? The precise balance between a Hittite wife's legal subordination to her husband, as laid out in the formal law codes, and her actual lived experience of agency influence and informal power within the household, and perhaps even the wider community, is a complex and fascinating area of ongoing research, with scholars meticulously analyzing not just the legal texts, but also private letters, religious documents, and even depictions in art for those subtle indicators of female autonomy. Negotiation and contribution that might not be immediately apparent from the face value of the patriarchal legal framework. Your Iwaru, that dowry you brought with you, could certainly be a factor here. While your husband might manage it as part of the general household assets, the laws often imply it remained in some sense distinct and intended for your benefit and that of your children, giving you a degree of economic leverage. The Hittite laws do reflect this household hierarchy. There are clauses that deal with a wife's obligations, often implicitly by outlining penalties for when those obligations are not met, as we'll see when we discuss adultery and divorce. There are likely provisions, though perhaps not always explicitly detailed, in the surviving main law collections concerning a husband's right to discipline members of his household within certain societal limits. However, it's crucial to note that Hittite law also shows a concern for fairness and the protection of individuals, even within this patriarchal structure. It wasn't a free-for-all for domestic tyrants. A quirky or fringe tidbit that offers a glimpse into the potential for high-status women to wield significant power comes from the Hittite royal sphere itself. Several Hittite queens, most famously Queen Putuhepa, the wife of King Hattusili III in the 13th century BC, were incredibly influential figures. Putuhepa corresponded directly with foreign rulers like Ramesses II of Egypt. Co-signed treaties played a major role in religious reforms and state cults, and clearly acted as a powerful political partner to her husband. While her extraordinary position was that of a queen, not an ordinary Hittite wife, It does suggest that the Hittite cultural framework was not entirely devoid of space for strong, intelligent women to exert considerable influence, at least within the highest echelons of society. For you, Jiria, navigating your new role as a Hittite wife would involve understanding these complex dynamics, your defined responsibilities within the household, your legal position relative to your husband, the importance of your contribution to the family's well-being and continuity, and the subtle ways in which you might exert your own influence and maintain your dignity within the established social order. It's a world where your life is intricately bound to that of your husband and his kin. Your days filled with the essential tasks that sustain the family, all under the watchful eyes of the household gods and the often very specific, very pragmatic laws of Hadassah. And if your new household includes your husband's mother, well, the classic mother-in-law dynamic alive and well, even in the Bronze Age. You can just imagine the subtle unspoken power plays over who makes the superior barley porridge whose ancestral gods are slightly more effective at warding off minor illnesses or ensuring a good harvest, and who really knows the bestest way to manage the household's precious supply of stored grain. It's a tale as old as time, or at least as old as the first cuneiform tablet detailing domestic bliss and its occasional legally adjudicated interruptions. You are now firmly ensconced within your new Hittite household, Egeria diligently fulfilling your roles as wife and household manager, navigating the intricacies of patriarchal authority and perhaps even the subtle politics of your husband's extended family. The laws have defined your entry into this union, the exchange of Kushata and Iwaru has been settled, and the wedding feast is a fading, pleasant memory. But what if your husband, this Bronze Age Anatolian man to whom your family has entrusted you, decides that one wife, however virtuous and skilled in wool carding, is simply insufficient? What did Hittite society and, more importantly, Hittite law have to say about monogamy, polygyny, and the status of any other women who might enter the household? This is where things can get particularly peculiar, and where the cuneiform tablets offer some rather intriguing, if sometimes ambiguous, insights. For most ordinary Hittites, it's generally assumed by scholars that monogamy, having one primary legally recognized wife, was the prevailing norm. The bulk of the laws concerning marriage, dowry, inheritance, and divorce seem to presuppose a single main wife whose status and rights and those of her children are carefully defined. This was likely a matter of both social custom and economic reality. Supporting multiple fully dowered wives and their respective households would have been beyond the means of the average Hittite farmer or artisan. The ideal, at least for commoners, seems to have been one legitimate wife, the mistress of the household, the mother of the legitimate heirs. However, when you look at the very top of Hittite society, things get a bit more crowded in the matrimonial department. A mainstream historical fact is that Hittite kings, much like their royal counterparts across the ancient Near East and Egypt, Mesopotamia, and elsewhere, frequently practiced polygyny. They often had multiple wives and a considerable number of concubines. These royal unions were driven by complex dynastic and diplomatic imperatives. Marrying princesses from vassal states or rival powers could cement alliances, secure peace treaties, or enhance the king's prestige. Different royal wives might hold different ranks, with one often designated as the Great Queen, or Tawanana, holding significant religious and sometimes political power. Her son would often be the primary heir. A quirky or fringe tidbit from the Hittite royal archives is that some of the surviving texts detailing palace intrigues and succession struggles reveal intense rivalries between these different royal wives, or ambitious queen mothers, each maneuvering to ensure their own son ascended to the throne. These accounts read like ancient soap operas full of accusations, counter-accusations, banishments, and occasionally a mysterious illness befalling a rival prince. It certainly suggests that a polygynous royal household, while perhaps politically expedient, wasn't always a haven of domestic tranquility. But what about non-royal Hittites? Could an ordinary nobleman or a wealthy merchant take more than one wife, or perhaps a secondary partner like a concubine? Here, the Hittite laws offer some tantalizing, if not entirely explicit clues. The precise prevalence and social acceptance of non-monogamous unions beyond accepted royal polygyny among ordinary Hittite citizens, and the exact legal and social distinctions between a fully dowered primary wife and other types of female partners within a single household, are areas where the interpretation of specific Hittite legal and textual evidence continues to be refined and sometimes debated by scholars. There isn't a law that says a man may have X number of wives. However, there are certain clauses that seem to acknowledge and regulate situations where a man has relationships or children with women other than his primary formally married wife. Hittite relationship statuses you begin to suspect were probably more complicated than a particularly dense cuneiform instruction manual for assembling a three-headed fire-breathing chariot with mismatched wheels. Is she officially wife number 1 with full dowry rights and first dibs on the best cuts of roasted goat? Or is she perhaps more of a wife 1.5 beta version with limited goat grazing privileges and access to the secondary grain silo? We really need an organizational flowchart for this household. For example, Hittite Law Far 31, using the standard numbering, discusses a scenario where a man might have a wife in one town, perhaps his primary residence in, say, Hattusa, and then takes another wife in a different town where he also has a household, maybe a rural estate or a trading outpost. The law then outlines the property arrangements if he later decides to consolidate his households and bring the second wife to the first wife's town. It seems to imply that such arrangements, while perhaps not the ideal, were recognized and needed legal regulation, particularly concerning property and the status of the women. More commonly addressed is the situation involving enslaved women within the household. Hittite Law Har 36, for instance, deals with a slave woman who bears children to her free master. The status of these children, and the slave woman herself, could vary sometimes depending on whether the master formally acknowledged them or made provisions for them. If the primary wife was childless, the children of such a union with a slave woman might even under certain circumstances be considered legitimate heirs, though the primary wife often had considerable say in this. The term often used for a woman in a secondary, less formal union, or perhaps a woman of lower status, brought into the household without the full panoply of kushata and iwaru, might be akin to concubine. Antushashashar is a Hittite term sometimes interpreted in this context, though its exact meaning can be complex. The legal standing of such a woman would almost certainly be inferior to that of the principal dowered wife. She would likely have fewer personal rights, less economic security, and her children might not automatically inherit on an equal footing with the children of the primary wife. The laws seem to suggest that while these secondary unions existed and were to some extent legally acknowledged, mostly in terms of regulating property and offspring, they did not confer the same status or protections as a full formal marriage. Imagine the internal dynamics of such a household, Ageria. If you were the primary wife, how would you feel about the presence of another woman sharing your husband and your home, even if her status was clearly subordinate? The potential for jealousy, rivalry, and conflict is immense. Morning barley water and domestic chores in a shared Hittite kitchen must have been an ongoing masterclass in subtle power dynamics expertly deployed. Passive aggression and the art of the perfectly thrown withering side-eye. Oh, you're using the good non-chipped grinding stone this morning. Are you, dear? How utterly delightful for you. The laws don't tell us much about the emotional landscape, but human nature suggests it wasn't always a harmonious Brady Bunch situation with extra Bronze Age wives. The Hittite legal system, with its characteristic pragmatism, seems less concerned with enforcing strict monogamy as a moral or religious imperative for all men, unlike its very strict views on wifely fidelity, as we shall see, and more with ensuring social order clarity regarding inheritance and the protection of property rights within these potentially complex family structures. Hittite lawyers and the scribes who meticulously recorded their pronouncements were clearly prepared for almost anything. You can almost picture a weary legal clerk on a Tuesday afternoon in Hattusa, sighing as another particularly convoluted domestic dispute is brought before him. Right. Let's consult the tablets. Clause 197, subsection B, revised paragraph 4. If a man's primary fully dowered wife and his secondary non-dowered household sheep shearer, who also happens to be the mother of two of his unacknowledged but generally well-behaved children, have an intractable dispute over who gets to use the last remaining clean linen loincloth on a festival day, the primary wife shall have precedence, unless it is the third Tuesday of the month, and raining heavily from the west, in which case, the matter shall be decided by a game of rock parchment sharpened reed stylus. Next case, please. Their aim was to provide a framework, however peculiar some of its clauses might seem to us, to manage the realities of human relationships and household formation in their ancient Anatolian world. You're now becoming quite familiar. Egeria with the ins and outs of standard Hittite marital arrangements. The contractual negotiations, the flow of kushata and iwaru, the patriarchal household structure, and even the legally acknowledged, if somewhat complicated, existence of secondary unions or concubines alongside a primary wife. It's a system designed above all for social order and the clear demarcation of rights and responsibilities. But just as Hittite law carefully defines what constitutes a proper union, it is equally, if not more, emphatic about what constitutes an improper, unacceptable, or downright forbidden union. And it is in these prohibitions, particularly those concerning relationships within the family, that we encounter some of the most stringent and peculiar aspects of Hittite social legislation. The Hittites, like virtually all human societies, had strong taboos against incestuous relationships, which they termed herkul, a word signifying an abomination, a grave sin, a capital offense that could bring divine wrath not just upon the individuals involved, but upon the entire community or even the land itself. A mainstream historical fact is that the Hittite law codes, particularly in a series of clauses typically numbered from Parawant 89 to Parawant 95 in modern compilations, contain explicit and stringent prohibitions against a range of sexual relationships, and by extension marriages deemed incestuous. These laws often carried the most severe penalties, including death. So what kind of unions fell under this dark shadow of herkul? The laws are quite specific. It was a capital crime for a man to have sexual relations with his own mother. Similarly, relations between a father and his daughter, or a man and his son, were also capital offenses. These prohibitions against direct parent-child incest are, of course, almost universally found across human cultures then and now, reflecting a fundamental taboo. The Hittites were no different in utterly condemning these acts. The idea of keeping track of permitted and forbidden relatives for marriage in Hittite society must have sometimes felt like navigating an incredibly complicated family tree diagram, possibly drawn on a very large, slightly dusty clay tablet with numerous bright red, emphatically underlined X's and stern cuneiform warnings. "No, no, my dear young Tudalia," a weary family elder might explain, "you absolutely cannot marry your third cousin twice removed on your great-aunt's mother's side, particularly if she was also briefly and somewhat scandalously married to your uncle's former favorite charioteer before he mysteriously disappeared during that unfortunate incident with the sacred honey badgers." The lineage charts are quite clear on this. Try the very nice, genealogically unambiguous girl from the next village whose family tree doesn't require 3 senior scribes, a diviner, and a detailed astrological consultation to verify. The laws go further, extending the prohibitions to other close familial relationships. It was forbidden and often a capital offense for a man to have relations with his son's wife, his daughter-in-law. Interestingly, relations with a wife's mother, mother-in-law, or a wife's sister, sister-in-law, were also explicitly forbidden, especially while the wife was still alive. This latter point is quite specific, and hints at concerns about disrupting the existing marital bond and the integrity of the immediate family unit. Some of these rules around in-laws could get quite nuanced, depending on whether certain parties were alive or deceased, or if prior relationships had existed. One of the most strongly condemned acts of herkul was sexual relations, and therefore marriage between full siblings, a brother with his sister. This too was a capital offense. While some other ancient cultures, most famously the Egyptian pharaohs, who practiced brother-sister marriage for dynastic and religious reasons, though this was highly exceptional and largely confined to royalty, or some instances in Greek mythology, often with dire consequences, the Hittite laws for the general populace seem to have taken a very firm and uncompromising stand against it. Why were these prohibitions so strict, and why were the penalties, often death, so severe? Several interwoven reasons likely contributed. Firstly, there was the fundamental concern for social order and the clarity of kinship lines. Incestuous relationships blur familial roles, create confusion in inheritance patterns, and disrupt the established social structure that marriage was designed to uphold. Secondly, and perhaps even more powerfully for the Hittites, was the religious dimension. These forbidden unions were not just social transgressions. They were profound sins, abominations, that polluted the land and deeply offended the Kayas. Such acts of Hercule were believed to bring divine anger and retribution upon the entire community, potentially manifesting as plague, famine, military defeat, or other disasters. The Hittites believed that if you broke these major incest taboos, it wasn't just awkward family dinners and a bit of social ostracism you had to worry about. It was much more along the lines of, the sacred barley crops will spontaneously wither and die. The royal sheep will develop a mysterious and highly contagious pox, and the great storm god Tarhuna himself might decide to personally redecorate your entire village with a particularly vindictive hailstorm, followed by a plague of extremely irritable and unusually large locusts. So yes, they took these matters very, very seriously. A quirky or fringe tidbit that underscores this spiritual dread is that some Hittite ritual texts meticulously describe complex purification ceremonies that were required to cleanse the land of the community or specific individuals after an act of Hercule had occurred, or been discovered. These rituals might involve specific offerings to appease the angered deity's scapegoat rituals and symbolic actions designed to remove the pollution and restore divine favor. This demonstrates just how deeply these transgressions were felt on a collective spiritual and cosmological level. The term Hercule itself sounds like something you'd instinctively shout if you accidentally dropped a very heavy clay tablet squarely on your big toe. But in the Hittite legal and religious lexicon, it signified that you'd done something so outrageously, catastrophically taboo that the gods themselves were probably reaching for the celestial smite with extreme prejudice button. It was in essence the ancient world's ultimate, "You have sinned, please prepare for imminent divine wrath" error message. The precise origins and specific social or religious rationales behind each and every one of the enumerated Hittite incest prohibitions, and whether they primarily reflect near-universal human taboos against close biological inbreeding and its observed negative consequences, or were more significantly shaped by culturally specific Anatolian kinship structures, religious beliefs and concerns about maintaining alliances between distinct family lines, continue to be analyzed and debated by legal anthropologists, Hittitologists, and historians of ancient religion. While the biological imperative to avoid the negative effects of close inbreeding likely played an underlying role in the development of such taboos across many human societies, the Hittites, like other ancient peoples, framed these prohibitions primarily in terms of social order and divine law. The enforcement of these laws against forbidden unions would have likely involved community vigilance, formal accusations and trials before local councils of elders, or for capital offenses before the king or his appointed judges. The severity of the prescribed penalties underscores the importance placed on upholding these fundamental rules of kinship and marriage. These weren't just suggestions, they were the bedrock of Hittite social morality, designed to keep the human world in harmony with the divine order and to prevent the kind of chaos that could unravel the very fabric of their society. The peculiar strictness of some of these forbidden clauses then speaks volumes about what the Hittites held sacred, what they feared, and how they sought to structure their world through the power of law. Section 11. You've navigated the rather stringent Hittite prohibitions against Hercularia, those forbidden unions within close familial lines that could bring down divine wrath and incur the death penalty. The message from the cuneiform tablets is starkly clear. The Hittites valued the integrity of kinship structures and the purity of family lines with utmost seriousness. But what happened when the marital bond itself, once legitimately formed, was threatened not by forbidden kinship, but by that age-old human failing infidelity? As you delve further into these ancient Anatolian laws, you'll discover that Hittite justice had some particularly severe and in some ways quite peculiar views on adultery and its consequences. When we talk about adultery in the Hittite context, as in many ancient patriarchal societies, the primary legal concern is almost invariably focused on the infidelity of a married woman. A wife's extramarital affair was considered a profound offense, a violation of her husband's exclusive rights, a threat to the legitimacy of his heirs, and a deep stain upon his honor and that of his household. Getting caught committing adultery in Hadassa, if you were the wife or her illicit partner, wasn't like finding yourself the subject of an awkward, hushed conversation at the local barley beer tavern, or perhaps a mildly scandalous reality TV show reveal with dramatic music. It was much more akin to an immediate, legally sanctioned, game over no extra lives, prepare for imminent and severe unpleasantness situation. particularly if your aggrieved spouse was feeling particularly and justifiably annoyed. They took the "till death do us part" vow very, very literally in certain circumstances. The Hittite laws, specifically in clauses typically numbered Barb 197 and 198 in modern scholarly editions, lay out the rather grim procedures. A mainstream historical fact is that these Hittite laws concerning adultery granted considerable and quite frightening power to the wronged husband. If a husband caught his wife in flagrante delicto, in the very act with another man, he had the legal right then and there to kill both of them on the spot. No trial necessary, no appeal to higher authorities. It was considered a justifiable if brutal response to a profound betrayal. This immediate fatal justice was his prerogative. However, the husband wasn't obliged to take this extreme path. He had options, which is where the peculiar aspect of Hittite law in this matter comes into sharper focus. If perhaps his initial rage cooled, or if there were other complicating factors, or if he saw him simply chose not to enact immediate lethal vengeance, he could bring his adulterous wife and her lover before the king, or more specifically to the king's gate, which served as the place of royal judgment. Here the king himself would hear the case and had the ultimate authority to decide their fate. The king could choose to spare their lives, perhaps imposing a lesser but still severe punishment, or he could confirm the death sentence. This introduction of royal prerogative offered a potential avenue for clemency, a check on purely personal vengeance, and an assertion of the state's ultimate authority even in such deeply personal matters. But here's where Hittite law 198 presents a particularly intriguing and much debated scenario. It states something to this effect: if a man seizes another man with his wife and brings them for judgment, before the king's gate or to the assembly, if he, the husband, says, "Let my wife not die," then he shall also spare the life of the man, the lover, and he shall also brand him, or perhaps less severely, just his head. But if he says, "Let them both die," then they shall roll the wheel, a phrase, possibly meaning they shall both be executed, perhaps by being crushed under a wheel, or it could refer to some other form of capital punishment or ordeal. The precise interpretation of this Hittite law, 198, particularly the clause linking the fates of the wife and her lover if the husband chooses to spare one, is a subject of ongoing discussion and varied interpretation by Hittitologists and legal historians. Does it mean the husband must treat both equally if he brings them to court? Either both live with the lover, perhaps suffering a lesser non-fatal punishment like branding or humiliation, or both die? Or did it offer the husband certain strategic options, perhaps allowing him to demonstrate mercy to his wife while still ensuring her lover faced a severe penalty, or vice versa under specific unstated circumstances? The wording is concise, leaving room for scholarly pondering on its exact practical application and underlying legal philosophy. It's like a Bronze Age legal puzzle. So the Hittite husband has caught his wife and her paramour in a rather compromising situation with the family's sacred olive oil press. He has options. Option A: extreme marital dissatisfaction expressed via conveniently available pointy objects. 100% legally sanctioned, no questions asked. Option B: drag them both covered in olive oil and shame before the king and hope for a dramatic royal pardon, or alternatively a really good public shaming, followed by a slightly less lethal punishment. Option C: magnanimously forgive his wife, which then rather awkwardly means he also has to forgive the other guy, though he might get to brand him with a "property of a very annoyed husband" mark. What a complicated, let's all just try to get along after this minor apocalyptic betrayal set of choices. What about adultery by a husband? Here the Hittite laws, like those of many ancient patriarchal societies, exhibit a clear double standard. A husband's extramarital affairs, especially with unmarried women, slave women or concubines within his own household, did not carry the same legal weight or the same severe penalties for him as a wife's infidelity did for her. It wasn't generally considered adultery in the same sense, as it didn't threaten the legitimacy of his primary wife's offspring or his direct lineage in the same way. Such liaisons might lead to social disapproval if they were particularly scandalous or disruptive to household harmony, or they could have legal implications for the status and inheritance rights of any children born from them. But the husband himself wasn't typically facing the death penalty or severe physical punishment for his own dalliances. A Hittite wife having an affair, major scandal, potential death penalty, for all involved divine wrath, the whole terrifying shebang. A Hittite husband having a bit on the side with an unattached serving wench or a willing shepherdess encountered during a routine inspection of his sheep. That was often just, well, Tuesday. The legal fine print on the concept of marital fidelity seems to have had some very distinct gender-specific clauses and exemptions. Beyond the immediate legal penalties, the social consequences of adultery, particularly for a woman and her family, would have been devastating. Shame, dishonor, and social ostracism would invariably follow. The children of an adulterous union would face an uncertain future. The alliance between the two families, so carefully forged at the time of marriage, would be shattered. A quirky or fringe tidbit, though, one that underscores the gravity with which such transgressions were viewed, is that some Hittite religious texts like prayers or omen interpretations allude to the idea that adultery, much like the Hercule of incest, could be seen as a source of ritual pollution that could anger the gods and bring misfortune upon the land or the community, sometimes requiring specific purification ceremonies to restore divine favor. The severity of these laws, especially concerning a wife's infidelity, stemmed from core Hittite societal concerns: the absolute importance of ensuring the purity of the husband's lineage and the legitimacy of his heirs who would inherit his name and property. The protection of the husband's property rights as a wife was, in some legal aspects, still tied to the economic transactions of Kushata and Iwaru, and the upholding of the husband's honor and authority within his household and the community. Adultery struck at the very heart of these fundamental social and familial structures, and Hittite law, in its own stern and sometimes peculiar way, sought to defend them with uncompromising, often lethal force. You've now confronted the rather grim and decidedly severe Hittite legal landscape surrounding adultery ageria, where a wronged husband often held the power of life and death over his unfaithful wife and her lover, albeit with a potential for royal clemency. The message is clear. The sanctity of the marital bond, particularly the wife's fidelity, and the undisputed legitimacy of offspring, was paramount and protected by the harshest of penalties. But what if the marital bond frayed for reasons other than infidelity? What if the carefully constructed contractual arrangement simply became untenable? Was divorce even an option in this ancient Anatolian society? And if so, under what peculiar circumstances could a Hittite couple untie the knot? The answer, is revealed by those invaluable cuneiform tablets, is yes, divorce was indeed a recognized legal possibility in the Hittite world. While marriage was undoubtedly intended to be a lifelong commitment, a stable cornerstone of society, the Hittite lawmakers, with their characteristic pragmatism, acknowledged that not all unions would endure. They therefore laid down specific, if sometimes rather particular, grounds and procedures for dissolving a marriage. A mainstream historical fact is that Hittite law, unlike some other ancient legal systems that made divorce exceedingly difficult or solely a male prerogative, did permit divorce under a range of specified circumstances. These laws were particularly concerned with the subsequent division of marital property, especially the Kushata bride price and the Iwaru dowry, with the allocation often depending on which party was deemed at fault or the specific nature of the separation. So, what were considered legitimate grounds for a Hittite divorce? As we've just seen, tating a wife's adultery, if her husband chose not to enact the death penalty, would almost certainly lead to divorce, likely with her being sent away in disgrace and potentially forfeiting her dowry or facing other financial penalties. This was perhaps the most straightforward, if brutal, scenario. Another significant, though more complex ground, was barrenness or the failure of the wife to produce children, particularly male heirs. In a society so deeply focused on lineage inheritance and the continuation of the family line, a childless marriage was a profound disappointment and a potential crisis for the household. If a wife proved unable to conceive, the husband might be permitted to divorce her, or as we touched upon in the context of secondary unions, he might choose to take another wife or concubine in the hope of producing offspring. The laws would then need to address the status and property rights of the first childless wife. Her fate and the disposition of her dowry could depend on whether she was considered at fault for the lack of children. A difficult and often unfair judgment in an era with no understanding of modern reproductive science. Abandonment or desertion by one spouse could also constitute grounds for dissolving the union. If a husband, for instance, went off on a long military campaign or trading journey, and simply never returned after a considerable period, or if a wife absconded from the marital home, the remaining spouse might eventually be able to seek a formal dissolution and the freedom to remarry. We saw a hint of this in Hittite law FAR 31, which discussed a man having a wife in one location and then taking another in a different place. If he then chose to bring the second to the first town and establish a single primary household, the law detailed the property division for the one who is effectively being set aside, which amounts to a form of divorce. The degree of judicial discretion versus strict application of the written statutes in actual Hittite divorce cases, particularly in the nuanced process of determining fault and thereby decreeing the precise division of often complex marital assets beyond what is explicitly spelled out for common straightforward scenarios, remains an area of ongoing and lively discussion among legal historians and Hittitologists. The surviving laws give us the framework, but the human dramas and legal arguments played out before Hittite judges or elders were likely far more intricate. Could a wife initiate divorce? This is where the patriarchal nature of Hittite society becomes very apparent. While not entirely impossible, it was certainly more difficult for a wife to dissolve a marriage than for her husband. The laws seem to grant the husband greater initiative and more favorable terms. However, under certain extreme circumstance, perhaps provable severe cruelty or neglect from the husband, his impotence, or perhaps if he took a secondary wife and treated the first one abusively. Hittite law bar 27 concerning a man taking his former slave girl as wife and then later marrying a free woman states the first wife shall not look to the same stool, implying some separation or status change, and that he must not oppress her. A wife might have been able to petition for a separation, though the financial outcome for her, particularly regarding the return of the bride price, might be less advantageous than if the husband initiated proceedings due to her fault. A Hittite wife deciding she wanted out of the marriage was probably a bit like a single sheep deciding it wanted to file a formal complaint against the entire wolf pack. Theoretically possible, perhaps if she had incredibly compelling grounds, a very powerful and supportive natal family willing to go to bat for her, and maybe a particularly enlightened panel of local elders, but definitely an uphill struggle against the prevailing patriarchal flock mentality. A quirky or fringe tidbit can be found in Hittite law FAR 35, which deals with a scenario somewhat akin to elopement, or perhaps a trial marriage. It states, if a man and a woman elope literally run together like fugitive slaves, and her father and mother later find them and seize them if they say, "We will not give her to you as wife," he, the man, loses his head, possibly meaning his initial deposit or part of the bride price paid. This suggests that even if a couple initiated a union themselves, the family still held considerable sway, and failure to follow through with the formal marriage contract after such an irregular start could have financial consequences for the would-be groom. It's like a Bronze Age cooling-off period with a non-refundable deposit if the in-laws decided they really didn't like your chariot parking skills after all. The procedures for divorce, once grounds were established, would likely have involved some formal declaration, possibly before community witnesses, local elders, or a court. It wasn't just a case of one spouse saying, "Right, I've had enough of your consistently lumpy barley porridge, your inability to properly sharpen a bronze axe, I'm off." The core of the legal proceedings, as reflected in the tablets, revolved around the meticulous division of property. This is where those carefully negotiated terms of the Kushata and Iwaru came back into sharp focus. Who got to keep what was the bride price returned to the husband's family? In full or only in part, did the wife get to take her entire dowry back, or was some of it forfeited if she was deemed the guilty party? The laws attempt to provide answers for various scenarios, often with a surprising level of detail concerning livestock, household goods, and even children. Hittite divorce court, one imagines, must have been a fascinating if somewhat stressful parade of human drama. Your Honor, my husband consistently claims my barley porridge is unacceptably lumpy, thereby causing him great emotional distress and an inability to perform his chariot driving duties with appropriate vigor. I counterclaim that his snoring is so loud, it has been known to frighten the sacred household goats, and is clearly grounds for me to take back my 3 best weaving looms. It's like ancient daytime courtroom TV, but with significantly more cuneiform and a higher chance of someone being awarded a slightly disgruntled ox in the settlement. The fate of any children from the union would also, of course, be a critical consideration, with laws likely stipulating custody and perhaps ongoing obligations for support, though details on this are sometimes less explicit than those concerning property. Untying the Hittite knot was clearly a serious, legally regulated process designed to manage the social and economic fallout of a failed marriage and to ensure that even in dissolution, a semblance of order and fairness, as understood by Hittite society, was maintained. The difficult decision has been made Egeria, or perhaps it has been made for you. The Hittite marriage, once a carefully constructed contract of alliance and expectation, has proven unsustainable. The grounds for divorce, whether a wife's proven adultery, a husband's particular dissatisfaction, prolonged abandonment, or perhaps even just a severe case of irreconcilable differences leading to one party hating the other, a surprisingly recognized concept in some clauses have been established before the relevant authorities, be it the local council of elders or even the king's gate for more serious or contentious cases. The knot so ceremonially tied is now to be legally and often quite painstakingly untied. And, as you might expect from the pragmatic, property-conscious Hittites, the immediate aftermath of this dissolution focuses intensely on one critical area: the meticulous and often fiercely debated division of assets and the determination of the children's fate. A mainstream historical fact is that the Hittite laws regarding divorce paid exceptionally detailed attention to the division of marital property. The allocation of the kushata, the bride price initially paid by the groom's family, the awaru, the dowry brought by the bride, any property or wealth acquired jointly during the marriage, and of course the custody and implicit future of any children were all subject to specific legal regulations. These regulations often hinged on which spouse was deemed to be primarily at fault for the breakdown of the union, or on the specific circumstances outlined in the relevant casuistic law. Imagine Hittite divorce lawyers if such a formal profession existed. As we know it, armed not with leather briefcases full of documents, but with stacks of very heavy clay tablets, an abacus for swiftly calculating sheep and silver shekel distributions, and perhaps a particularly stern-looking scribe ready to chisel the final binding settlement onto a fresh slab of damp clay. "Objection, Your Honor," one might dramatically intone, pointing an accusatory finger. My esteemed client clearly stated in the original marriage contract paragraph 4 subsection C that the slightly chipped but still remarkably serviceable three-legged goat was unequivocally part of her personal dowry, and not as opposing counsel brazenly suggests jointly acquired livestock subject to equal division. We have witnesses who can attest to the goat's premarital bleeding patterns. Let's start with the kushta. That substantial bride price your husband's family paid to your father to secure the marriage. What happens to it now? If you, the wife, are found to be the party primarily at fault, say for proven adultery or for abandoning your husband without just cause, then your natal family might well be required to return the kushata in full, or at least a significant portion of it, to your now ex-husband's family. This was in effect a financial penalty for the breach of the marital contract and compensation for the dishonor or loss suffered by the husband. Conversely, if your husband was deemed to be the one primarily at fault, perhaps he unjustly accused you, treated you with extreme cruelty beyond the bounds of accepted patriarchal authority, or unilaterally decided to dissolve the union without legitimate grounds as defined by law, then he might forfeit any claim to the return of the kushata. It would remain with your family, a compensation for the wrong done to you and them. In cases where fault was less clear-cut, or perhaps in situations of mutual agreement to separate under specific circumstances, the division or retention of the kushata could be more nuanced, possibly prorated, based on the duration of the marriage or the number of children produced. Then there is your iwaru, the dowry you brought into the marriage. This was, as we've discussed, intended to provide for your support and was often considered your personal property, or at least property designated for you and your children. In many divorce scenarios, especially if you were not the guilty party, Hittite law appears to have strongly favored your right to take your iwaru back with you. This was a crucial provision offering a divorced woman some measure of economic independence and resources, as she perhaps returned to her father's household or contemplated a future remarriage. The Hittite divorce settlement process often sounds like a very intense episode of a Bronze Age antique roadshow combined with a livestock auction. All right then, the elders have decreed she gets to keep the 3 good, non-argumentative sheep, the loom, with the slightly less frayed warp threads, and the non-leaky bronze water jug. He, on the other hand, gets the rather neurotic goat with the unfortunate flatulence problem. the ceremonial headdress with the missing sacred feather, and a lifetime supply of profound regret. Are we all agreed on this equitable distribution, or do we need to bring in the royal arbitrator and his very large, very intimidating clay tablet of ultimate consequences? Of course, complications could arise. What if some of your dowry items, say a particularly fine woolen cloak or several jars of valuable olive oil, had been used up, worn out, or lost during the course of the marriage? The laws might then attempt to address fair compensation or substitution, though the specifics here can be less clear from the surviving texts. If you, the wife, were found to be egregiously at fault, for instance, in a clear case of adultery, you might forfeit your claim to some or even all of your dowry, which could then be retained by your husband as a further penalty. What about property that you and your husband acquired together during your marriage? This community property aspect is also touched upon. For example, Hittite Law 427, which deals with a rather complex scenario where a man first marries his former slave girl and then later takes a free woman as a second and presumably primary wife, states that if he and the first former slave girl wife then separate, he shall divide the household property in half. The wife shall take one child and the husband shall take the other children. i.e., this indicates a principle of dividing jointly managed assets and also addresses child custody in that specific context. Similarly, Law 531 concerning a man who has wives in 2 different towns and then decides to consolidate his household by bringing the second wife to the first wife's town, effectively divorcing the first one. If she doesn't agree to the new arrangement, states that he must provide the departing first wife with a house and her children, suggesting a settlement that ensures her basic needs are met. The fate of the children was naturally a matter of profound concern. The extent to which the division of children in Hittite divorce cases prioritized strictly patrilineal concerns, meaning keeping the children, especially sons, with the father's lineage and under his authority, versus giving weight to considerations for the mother's ongoing role in their care, or the children's own immediate welfare, is a complex issue. With legal clauses and references in other texts offering varying scenarios that scholars continue to interpret to understand the underlying principles. As seen in Para 27s, the mother might retain custody of at least one child. Younger children, especially infants, might naturally remain with their mother. The primary concern, however, would likely have been to ensure the children were provided for and their lineage and inheritance rights where applicable were clearly defined post-divorce. A quirky or fringe tidbit found in the laws Bar 32 to 33 addresses situations that seem akin to a very early form of annulment or a breakdown before the marriage is fully established. If a man takes a woman, i.e., the kushada is paid and she comes to his house, but then he hates her or she hates him before the marriage is consummated or before they have lived together as a fully established couple for any length of time, the rules for the return of the bride price and dowry might be different and perhaps simpler than for a long-standing marriage with children. It's like a Hittite return to sender before fully unwrapping policy for marriages that get off to a particularly rocky start. The social status of divorced individuals would also be affected. A divorced woman, depending on the circumstances of the divorce and whether she retained her dowry, might return to her natal family or seek remarriage. A divorced man was also free to remarry, though he might first need to accumulate a new kushada if the previous one was forfeited or if his assets were diminished by the settlement. Ultimately, the Hittite laws governing the aftermath of divorce reveal a society that, while deeply invested in the stability of marriage, also recognized the need for orderly and relatively fair mechanisms to dissolve unions that had failed. The meticulous attention to property rights underscores the economic importance of marriage, while the provisions, however limited for the wife and children, suggest a societal concern for preventing utter destitution and maintaining a degree of social cohesion even when the personal bonds of matrimony had been broken. The often intricate and sometimes rather fraught process of untying the Hittite marital knot with its meticulous division of sheep, goats, cauldrons, and human offspring has given you a clear picture, Egeria, of how this Bronze Age Anatolian society managed the breakdown of its fundamental family units. The laws in their pragmatic way sought to restore a semblance of order and ensure that assets were redistributed according to perceived fault and established custom. But divorce wasn't the only way a Hittite marriage could end. The death of a spouse, particularly the death of a husband, presented its own set of challenges and societal solutions, leading us to another peculiar and deeply significant Hittite custom, levirate marriage. Imagine the scenario. You are a Hittite wife, your husband, the head of your household, has tragically passed away, perhaps from illness, an accident in the fields, or lost in one of the Hittites' many military campaigns against troublesome neighbors like the Casca peoples or the Arzawa lands. You are now a widow. In a patriarchal society like that of Hadassah, a widow, especially if she was young or had young children, could find herself in a vulnerable position both socially and economically. What was to become of you? Would you return to your natal family? Would you be left to fend for yourself? Hittite law provided a very specific and for many obligatory answer. This answer is found most clearly in the famous Hittite law Arwat Antindiri, which outlines the principle of levirate marriage. A mainstream historical fact is that levirate marriage, the practice whereby a man marries or is sometimes obliged to marry his deceased brother's widow, was a legally recognized and often mandatory custom in Hittite society, as explicitly detailed in their law codes. This practice, far from being unique to the Hittites, is found in various forms across many ancient and traditional cultures, including ancient Israel as described in the Old Testament. The term levirate itself comes from the Latin word lever, meaning a husband's brother. The primary purpose of levirate marriage in the Hittite context, as in many societies that practiced it, was twofold. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, to ensure the continuation of the deceased man's lineage, especially if he died childless. Any sons born to the union between the widow and her deceased husband's kinsmen were often considered, at least for legal and inheritance purposes, to be the heirs of the first deceased husband. This maintained his name and his line. Secondly, it served to keep the deceased husband's property, including his wife's dowry awaru, and any claim she might have on his estate consolidated within his own family or clan, preventing the dispersal of assets that might occur if the widow remarried outside the kin group or returned to her natal family with her dowry. It was a mechanism for preserving family wealth and continuity. And thirdly, from a social perspective, it provided the widow with continued male protection, social standing as a married woman, and economic support within her late husband's familiar family structure, thus avoiding her becoming a burden on her own birth family, or being left entirely destitute and vulnerable. Now, the Hittite version of this custom, as laid out in Law Baramam 193, has a particularly striking and, to modern sensibilities, rather peculiar cascade of obligation. The law states something along these lines: if a man has a wife and the man dies, his brother shall take the deceased's wife. If his brother is also not alive, or perhaps if there is no brother of suitable age or status, his father, the deceased man's father, i.e. the widow's father-in-law, shall take her. If his father also dies, then the first deceased husband's son by another wife, i.e. the widow's stepson, if he was from a different mother, shall take her. This hierarchical list of who was next in line to marry the widow is quite remarkable in its specificity. Hittite family planning for the aftermath of a husband's untimely demise was clearly like a very serious, legally binding game of tag your it for the surviving male relatives. All right, gentlemen, our dear brother Puduhepa the Younger has unfortunately gone to feast with the sun goddess of Arena much sooner than anticipated. Tragic, truly tragic. Now, as per Law Power 993, his eldest surviving brother, Tarhunmia, you're up first to marry the widow. What's that? Tarhunmia is currently away on a 3-year chariot expedition to subjugate the rebellious western provinces. Inconvenient. Very well then. Esteemed father-in-law Hantili, you're next on the roster. Oh dear, Hantili has also recently joined the ancestors after a rather unfortunate incident involving a sacred but unexpectedly aggressive mountain goat. This complicates matters. Right then, young Zidanta, you're the deceased's son by his other wife, aren't you? Excellent, congratulations, lad. You've just won yourself a new stepmother. Wife, we trust you'll treat her and her not inconsiderable dowry of 12 sheep and a very fine bronze cauldron with the respect they deserve. From your perspective as the Hittite widow Egeria, your agency in this matter seems rather limited, at least according to the letter of the law. The law frames it as an obligation falling upon the male kinsman. Your consent is not highlighted as a primary factor. The Hittite widow's apparent range of choices for her next husband, according to this particular legal cascade, was something like A. Your recently acquired brother-in-law whom you may or may not particularly like. B. Failing that, your potentially quite elderly father-in-law. And if he's also unavailable, possibly your stepson, which could lead to some truly unique family dynamics. It's not exactly a Bronze Age dating app with an endless scroll of eligible bachelors, is it? Of course, there were likely practical considerations. The kinsman expected to marry you might already have a wife. In such cases, the levirate marriage could result in a polygynous household, where you would become a second wife, though perhaps one with a distinct status due to the circumstances. The emotional complexities for all involved, you, the new husband, his existing wife if any, can only be imagined. The social and emotional realities for individuals directly involved in these Hittite levirate marriages, particularly for the widow who might have little say in her remarriage to a close relative of her deceased husband, and for the kinsman now obliged to take on this additional responsibility, who might already have his own wife and established family, are exceptionally difficult to fully reconstruct from the typically terse and impersonal legal provisions, leaving scholars to speculate on the personal dynamics potential for affection or conflict and the overall quality of life within such legally mandated unions. A quirky or fringe tidbit that highlights the unusual nature of this Hittite levirate cascade is precisely that inclusion of the father-in-law and even the stepson from the deceased husband's lineage. While brother levirate marriage is relatively common in the ethnographic and historical record, marriage to one's father-in-law, or a stepson from the deceased husband's side would seem very strange, even taboo from many other cultural perspectives, including later European ones. This Hittite provision underscores their intense focus on keeping the woman, her reproductive potential, and her property strictly within the deceased husband's patrilineal family group, no matter how unusual the resulting spousal pairing might appear to outsiders. Were there ways to refuse the law? 193 doesn't explicitly offer an opt-out clause for either the widow or the obligated kinsman. Refusal by the kinsman might have incurred social shame or even legal penalties for failing in a familial duty. Though the texts are not clear on this, for you, the widow refusing such a marriage would likely mean a very uncertain future, potentially forfeiting your claim to your dowry, your place within your late husband's family, and any means of support. The pressure to conform for your own security and that of any children you might have had with your first husband would have been immense. The Hittites were clearly very serious about ensuring that no family line unexpectedly died out, and that no valuable property, including the human resources represented by a widow of childbearing age and her dowry, was lost to the kin group. The widow's new path, often dictated by the levirate marriage duty, was thus a path designed primarily to serve the continuity and cohesion of her deceased husband's family, a stark reminder of the collective priorities that often overshadowed individual desires in the ancient world of Hattusa. You've now explored the rather pragmatic and sometimes quite startling Hittite customs surrounding the end of a marriage ageria, be it through divorce with its meticulous division of assets, or through the death of a husband, leading to the often obligatory path of levirate marriage. These laws etched into enduring clay all underscore a profound societal concern for order, property, and the continuation of family lines. And it is this very continuation, the next generation of Hittites, the children born within these legally defined unions, that we now turn our sleepy attention to. What was the status of children in Hattusa? How did Hittite law define their legitimacy, protect their rights such as they were, and dictate their crucial place in the intricate tapestry of family inheritance? The paramount importance of children, especially legitimate heirs in Hittite society, cannot be overstated. As we've seen, a primary purpose of the carefully contracted Hittite marriage was procreation, the begetting of offspring who would carry on the family name, inherit the ancestral lands and property, perform the necessary rites for the family gods and deceased ancestors, and provide support for their parents in old age. In a world without state pensions or social security, children were your future, your security, your claim to a form of immortality through lineage. Legitimacy, therefore, was a matter of considerable legal and social significance. Children born to a legally recognized wife, that is, a woman for whom the Kushata bride price had been duly paid by her husband's family and who had likely brought with her an Iwaru dowry from her own kin, were generally considered fully legitimate. They were the undisputed heirs of their father, entitled to his name, his property, and full membership in his lineage. In Hittite society, proving you were a legitimate heir wasn't just about having your dad's slightly distinctive characterful nose, or his unfortunate tendency to snore like a distant siege engine. It was about having your birth validated by a socially sanctioned, legally contracted marriage, ensuring your mother's Iwaru was properly accounted for, and generally being on the right side of a whole stack of cuneiform tablets that implicitly confirmed your place in the world. But what about children born from unions of a less formal or less elevated status? As we touched upon when discussing the possibility of secondary wives or concubines, the Hittite laws acknowledge these more complex household arrangements. The status of children born to, say, an enslaved woman, Antushash Eshar, by her free master was more nuanced. Hittite law, Bafra 36, for example, addresses this directly, stating that if a slave woman bears children to her master and he acknowledges them as his own, they might be considered legitimate and have inheritance rights, though perhaps not always on an equal footing with children born to his primary freeborn wife. The consent or attitude of the primary wife could also play a significant role here. If she was childless, she might be more inclined or even legally encouraged in some societal frameworks to accept her husband's children by another woman as part of the household and lineage. If she had her own sons, the situation could become considerably more fraught with potential rivalries. The precise rights and social mobility available to children born from unions of differing legal status in Hittite society, e.g., children of a primary wife versus those of a concubine or an enslaved woman, and the extent to which they could be fully integrated into the paternal lineage through processes like formal legitimization or adoption, continue to be areas of detailed study and careful interpretation by Hittitologists, sifting through legal clauses, adoption contracts, and other textual evidence. Inheritance laws naturally reflected this emphasis on legitimacy and lineage. Hittite society was strongly patrilineal, meaning descent and property typically passed down through the male line. A mainstream historical fact is that in Hittite law, sons were generally the primary inheritors of their father's estate, particularly land, which was the fundamental basis of wealth and status, and the headship of the family. Daughters, as we've seen, usually received their portion of the family wealth in the form of their dowry iwaru upon marriage, which was then intended for their support within their husband's household and for their own children. However, if a man had no sons, the situation became more complex. A daughter might then inherit more substantially, or as we will see with adoption, her husband could be brought into her father's lineage to ensure its continuation. The laws might also have specified how property was to be divided among multiple legitimate sons. Was there a system of primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited the largest share or the primary ancestral estate, or was a more equal division practiced? The Hittite laws sometimes hint at specific shares or items going to particular sons, but a universally applied rigid rule is not always clear from the surviving general law collections, and may have varied by local custom or specific family agreements. The laws also addressed the unfortunate possibility of a father wishing to disinherit a particularly rebellious or unsatisfactory son, outlining procedures and perhaps limitations on this power. Adoption was another important legal mechanism within Hittite family law, often employed to address issues of heirship and lineage continuity. The Hittites had a formal process for adoption, sometimes recorded on a tupi parquish, literally a tablet of cleanliness or tablet of purity, signifying the adopted person's legitimate incorporation into the new family. Adoption wasn't just a sentimental act, it had profound legal consequences. An adopted son, for instance, gained the full legal rights of a natural-born son, including the right to inherit. This was particularly crucial for childless couples who wished to ensure their family name and property would continue. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that one of the most common forms of adoption seems to have been the adoption of a son-in-law by his wife's father, especially if the father had no sons of his own. By adopting his daughter's husband, the father-in-law effectively made him his own son of the house, ensuring that the family estate and lineage would pass through his daughter and her husband to their children, thus preserving the ancestral line. No son to inherit your thriving goat cheese and bronze plowshare empire. No problem. Just formally adopt your remarkably competent, if slightly bewildered, son-in-law. Welcome to the family, son I mean other son. Here's your ceremonial cheese-stirring ladle, a seat on the family council, and a significant share in the future profits. Just try not to look so surprised, and please sign this clay tablet in triplicate. What about the guardianship of minor children, if their parents died or divorced? The laws, while not always providing exhaustive detail on every eventuality, would certainly have had provisions for this, generally favoring the paternal kin, in line with the patrilineal structure of society. The well-being and proper upbringing of children, especially those who would inherit property and carry on family traditions, was a clear concern of Hittite law. Hittite children probably didn't have rights in the modern individualistic sense. Their existence was largely defined by their responsibilities and their place within the family hierarchy. It was likely more a case of one, do not under any circumstances annoy the household gods by, say, using their sacred offering dish as a toy boat. 2. Learn to card wool or identify different types of edible Anatolian grubs by approximately age 5. 3. Try very hard not to get accidentally traded to a neighboring tribe for a particularly good hunting dog or a slightly used but still quite fashionable bronze earring during a period of severe famine. Childhood in the Bronze Age was, one imagines, a constant character-building adventure. The children of Hattusa, then, were a precious resource, the future of every Hittite household, and by extension the empire itself. Their legitimacy, their upbringing, and their eventual inheritance were all matters of significant legal and social import, carefully regulated by those remarkably detailed and occasionally quite peculiar laws inscribed on enduring clay. You've explored the Hittite laws surrounding the precious children of Hattusa Agaria. Understanding how their legitimacy, inheritance, and even their adoption were matters of significant legal and social concern, all designed to ensure the orderly continuation of family lines and the stable transfer of property. But Hittite society, like all major Bronze Age civilizations, was not composed solely of free citizens. It included a substantial population of enslaved individuals, acquired through warfare debt or by birth. This leads us to a rather complex and, from a modern perspective, morally challenging area of Hittite family law. What provisions, if any, did these cuneiform tablets make for marriage in chains? For the unions and family lives of those who were themselves considered property? The very idea might seem like a contradiction in terms to us. How can individuals who lack fundamental personal freedom and legal autonomy truly enter into a meaningful marriage contract? Yet, remarkably, Hittite law did not entirely ignore the relationships formed by enslaved people. A mainstream historical fact is that Hittite law, unlike some other ancient legal systems, which often treated slave unions as having no legal standing whatsoever, provided a distinct framework for recognizing and regulating marriages involving enslaved individuals. These laws addressed unions both between two slaves, and even more intriguingly, between a slave and a free person, touching upon issues like the status of children born from such unions, and the disposition of any meager property they might accumulate. Let's first consider marriages between two slaves who belong to the same master. From the master's perspective, permitting or even encouraging such unions could be pragmatically beneficial. A stable slave household might lead to a more content and productive workforce. Furthermore, any children born to such a union would typically also be slaves belonging to the master, thus increasing his human capital. The laws themselves don't go into great detail about the internal formalities of these intra-slave unions, as they were largely within the master's purview, but their existence is implicitly acknowledged. A Hittite slave marriage contract, if such a thing even existed in written form, was probably less about declarations of undying love and the poetic exchange of vows, and more about Master A hereby agrees and records that his enslaved field worker, Grumph, son of Unknown, may henceforth cohabitate with Master A's enslaved wool carder, Zizzle, daughter of also Unknown, with the understanding that any resulting mini-slaves shall be duly registered as property of Master A as per Hittite law subsection C, paragraph 2, and neither Grumph nor Zizzle shall attempt to abscond with the good milking pail or the slightly less chipped grinding stone. Romance. The situation became more legally complex and thus more explicitly addressed in the laws, when slaves belonging to different masters wished to form a union, or when a union involved a slave and a free person. If a male slave belonging to Master A wished also to marry a female slave belonging to Master B, this would require a formal agreement between the two masters. The kushata, or bride price, if paid, would likely be a transaction between the masters rather than the slaves themselves, perhaps compensating Master B for the loss of some of his female slaves' labor, or her reproductive potential now being shared with Master A's household. The laws would also need to stipulate who legally owned any children born from such an intermaster union. Often the children would belong to the master of the mother, following the ancient principle of partus sequitur ventrum. Offspring follows the womb, but this could be subject to specific agreements. Even more fascinating are the laws dealing with marriages between a slave and a free person. This is where Hittite law shows some of its most peculiar and surprisingly detailed considerations. What if a free woman chose to marry a male slave? This was a socially fraught situation. Hittite law 434 states, if a free man runs away with a slave woman from another land or from an enemy, etc., and he takes her across to his own land and takes her as his wife if afterwards they are found, and she had no bride price given for her, she becomes a slave. This suggests a free man could marry a foreign slave woman if her status was regularized perhaps by paying something to her original owner or captor. However, for a free woman to marry a male slave was generally viewed more critically. Law 434 also implies that if a free woman willingly marries a male slave, she might lose her free status and become a slave herself, especially if her family disapproved and refused to sanction the union by accepting a bride price, which in this case would be paid by the slave's master to the free woman's family, a reverse of the usual direction for a free man marrying a slave woman. It was a bold and socially risky move for a free woman. Her family probably had a collective, horrified conniption fit. But darling Anitas, think of your social standing. Think of the family honor. And who on earth will inherit great Auntie Puduhepa's rather extensive, if slightly cursed, collection of highly valuable bronze nose rings and ceremonial goat hair wigs? Marrying a slave, it's simply not done. Conversely, if a free man took his own female slave as a wife or concubine, the situation was different. We touched on this in Law Number 27. If a man takes his slave girl as wife, and then he sets up house for her, and then he takes a free woman as his first-ranking wife, that first one, the slave girl wife, shall not look to the same stool. But if they later separate, he shall divide his household property in half. The former slave girl wife shall take one child, the husband shall take the other children. This is remarkable. It suggests that a female slave could achieve a recognized, albeit secondary wifely status with rights to some property, and at least one child upon separation, even if a free wife was later introduced. Law 436 further clarifies that if a master begets children with his female slave and acknowledges them, they can be heirs if he has no other legitimate freeborn offspring. The extent to which the Hittite legal provisions for slave marriages and the status of their children reflect a genuine, albeit limited, concern for the welfare and personhood of enslaved individuals versus primarily serving the pragmatic economic interests of slave owners by regulating their human property and ensuring a stable, self-reproducing workforce is a subject of ongoing and complex discussion among historians of ancient slavery and law. It was likely a mixture. These laws, while operating firmly within the brutal framework of a slave-owning society, do show an attempt to bring a degree of order, predictability, and even certain minimal rights to the domestic lives of enslaved people, which was not always the case in other ancient slave systems. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is found in another part of Law 434, which states that if a herdsman, who might be free but of low status, elopes with a free woman, and they are caught, he has to pay a certain amount of silver as compensation. But then it adds a twist. If a free man elopes with a slave woman belonging to another, and he is caught and refuses to pay the relatively small compensation to her master, the master then has the right to take the free man himself as a slave. It's a sort of, you break it, you bought it, or in this case, you become it, kind of legal logic, a stark warning to free men about respecting the property rights of slave owners, even in matters of the heart, or at least matters of elopement. The property rights of slave couples were naturally extremely limited. Slaves themselves were property. Any meager possessions they might accumulate, a few pots, some worn clothing, a small tool, would technically belong to their master. However, the laws sometimes acknowledge these slave belongings in cases of separation, suggesting a recognition of some level of personal use, if not outright ownership. These Hittite laws on marriage in chains, Ageria paint a picture of a society grappling with the inherent contradictions of an institution that treated human beings as property, yet also had to acknowledge their fundamental human need for companionship, family, and some semblance of a regulated domestic life. It's a testament to the Hittite legal mind's attempt to bring order even to the most challenging and morally ambiguous corners of their Bronze Age world. The Hittite slave owners, one might cynically surmise, probably saw allowing and regulating slave marriages as a pretty good long-term investment. Happy, or at least domestically stable slaves are generally more productive slaves. And bonus, they might just produce more little slaves for me entirely free of charge. It's a win-win, mostly for me, the enlightened and economically savvy owner, but still. Good for morale. What? You've journeyed deep into the heart of ancient Anatolia. Egeria, not with sturdy sandals this time, but with your mind's eye, sifting through the ghostly dust of millennia that once settled upon the cuneiform clay tablets of Hattusa. We've decoded the often pragmatic, sometimes startling, and occasionally quite peculiar ways in which the Hittites sought to regulate that most fundamental of human institutions, the family. From the contractual bargains of marriage, the careful weighing of Kushata and Iwaru, and the arranged unions designed to forge alliances to the stark prohibitions against Hercule, the severe penalties for adultery, the orderly processes for divorce, the curious customs of levirate marriage, the defined status of children, and even the surprising legal recognition given to the unions of enslaved individuals. It has been quite the exploration into a Bronze Age legal and social landscape. Now, as our sleepy perusal of these ancient laws draws to its close, what overarching understanding do we take away? What do these detailed, often very specific Hittite marriage and divorce laws ultimately reveal about their societal values and their relentless quest for a well-ordered world? The most striking impression, perhaps, is the profound Hittite emphasis on order and stability. A mainstream historical fact is that the Hittite legal system, as preserved on those remarkable cuneiform tablets, demonstrates a highly sophisticated and surprisingly comprehensive attempt by a major Bronze Age society to create a detailed framework for social regulation. They weren't just making up rules as they went along. They were building a system, and a huge part of that system was dedicated to defining and defending the integrity of the family unit, which they clearly saw as the absolute bedrock of their society. For the Hittites, social order wasn't just a pleasant ideal to strive for. In a world of often harsh environmental conditions, powerful neighboring empires, and internal political complexities, it was a vital survival strategy. Keep the families stable and productive. The underlying logic seems to be, keep the property lines clear and undisputed. Keep the gods happy by punishing transgressions. And for everyone's sake, try very hard not to accidentally marry your aunt or elope with the temple's sacred goat. It's not exactly rocket science. Well, actually, it's more akin to advanced Bronze Age, chariot, and irrigation system science, which in its own way is probably just as complicated. These laws reveal a society deeply concerned with lineage and the orderly transfer of property. Marriage was the primary mechanism for this, and therefore it had to be meticulously regulated. The intricate rules about bride price and dowry weren't just about economics. They were about cementing relationships between families, defining the status of the spouses and their offspring, and ensuring that wealth, be it land, livestock, or precious metals, was managed and passed down in a predictable, conflict-minimizing way. The patriarchal nature of Hittite society is, of course, undeniable and clearly reflected in the laws. The husband was the head of the household with considerable authority. Yet, as we've seen, Hittite law wasn't entirely a one-way street. Women, particularly freeborn wives, did possess certain recognized rights, especially concerning their dowry, which provided them with a measure of economic security. The laws also show a degree of pragmatism and acknowledgement of complex human realities, even within the enslaved population, by providing at least some framework for their unions and the status of their children. This is perhaps more nuanced than some other ancient legal codes that could be more absolutist or simply silent on such matters. The religious underpinnings of Hittite law are also crucial. The concept of Hercule, that grave abomination resulting from forbidden unions, underscores a belief that certain actions could pollute the land and incur divine wrath, threatening the well-being of the entire community. The laws, therefore, were not just about human social contracts. They were also about maintaining a right relationship with the powerful and often rather demanding gods of the Hittite pantheon. The degree to which the Hittite state could effectively and consistently enforce its detailed legal codes across the entirety of its often geographically diverse and sometimes loosely controlled Anatolian empire versus the laws primarily reflecting ideals or established practices centered in the capital city of Hattusa and its core territories remains a subject of ongoing historical investigation and scholarly discussion. Were these laws universally applied with the same rigor in a distant mountain village as they were in the shadow of the royal palace? It's hard to say for certain, but their very existence, their careful preservation by generations of scribes, speaks to a powerful societal aspiration for justice, fairness, as they understood it, and above all, order. A quirky or fringe tidbit, though not directly related to marriage law, but indicative of this broader Hittite concern for regulation and perhaps even a surprising degree of societal mindfulness, is that some of their laws show an unexpected concern for the welfare of domestic animals or the protection of the environment. There are, for instance, fines prescribed for causing an ox to miscarry through mistreatment or for polluting a well or spring. While this might seem far removed from divorce proceedings, it hints at a wider legal and ethical consciousness that sought to regulate many aspects of life to ensure harmony and prevent undue harm or disruption. This same spirit of detailed regulation clearly extended to the complexities of human family relationships. As you reflect on these ancient Anatolian lives, Egeria governed by these peculiar, detailed, and sometimes surprisingly insightful laws, you realize that despite the vast gulf of time and culture that separates their Bronze Age world from our own, the fundamental human concerns remain remarkably similar. The Hittites, with their chariots and their cuneiform and their very, very specific rules about who gets the best goats in a divorce settlement, might seem incredibly distant and almost alien. But they, like us, were grappling with the same big, timeless questions: how to form lasting and stable partnerships, how to raise children and provide for their future, how to manage property and resources fairly, how to deal with conflict and betrayal within families, and ultimately how to create a society where people can live together with a reasonable degree of predictability, security, and order. Their answers, preserved on those dusty clay tablets, might seem strange to us now, but they were their earnest attempt to navigate the eternally complex, often messy, and always fascinating business of being human together. The Hittites basically tried to write a comprehensive user manual for their entire society, right down to section 789, subsection C, paragraph 12. What to do if your neighbor's unusually sacred and highly opinionated chicken repeatedly wanders into your meticulously planted prize-winning turnip patch and causes significant emotional distress to said turnips. They were in their own way the original overthinkers of legal and social minutiae, and for the fascinating window they offer us into their lost world, we can only be grateful. The clay tablets of Hattusa, with their intricate wedge-shaped pronouncements on who can marry whom and what happens when they decide they'd rather not, anymore, now begin to fade from our view. Egeria. The sounds of the Bronze Age Anatolian household, the grinding of grain, the bleating of goats, the murmur of Hittite voices discussing bride prices and dowry negotiations, grow soft and distant. We have journeyed through a world where marriage was a contract, where divine displeasure was a very real concern, and where the law in its own stern and pragmatic way sought to weave a fabric of order across the complexities of human relationships. You've seen how these ancient people so far removed from us in time grappled with issues that still resonate today. The balance of individual desire versus family obligation. The economic realities of partnership, the pain of betrayal, the challenges of raising children, and the quest for stability in an often uncertain world. Their solutions, preserved on those remarkable tablets, might seem peculiar, even harsh at times to our modern sensibilities, but they were born of their own unique culture, their own beliefs, their own relentless efforts to make sense of and bring order to the human condition. The Hittites, with their chariots and their storm gods, their intricate laws and their lost capital, eventually vanished from the stage of history, their empire crumbling to dust. But the echoes of their attempts to regulate life, love, and family linger on, a quiet testament to the enduring human need for structure, for justice, and for a way to navigate the often turbulent waters of our closest relationships.